The main character is forced to marry her own brother. To avoid this, she turns to a demon, but what happens next is simply shocking. Watch to the end to find out. Be sure to subscribe to the channel for my efforts. It all began in a huge mansion, where the wind roared along the street, as if covering the entire building with a roar. Inside, a bright light burned, clearly indicating someone's presence and lively movement within the walls of the house. On the top floor, a narrow room with a tiny window was hidden, through which the flickering glow of a candle, almost lost in the dense darkness, barely filtered through. The girl sat directly under the open window, absorbed in writing and completely oblivious to the howling wind outside. The candle on the windowsill did not go out despite the fierce gusts, and this did not bother her in the least. Her entire attention was focused on the crumpled sheet of paper. Her hand slowly, painstakingly traced the elegant letters. Having completed one letter, she immediately began the next, without taking her thoughts off the lines. Her name was Giovinetta Waldemar, and she turned 23 this year. She was the eldest daughter of Grand Duke Waldemar, twin sister of the current Duke John I, and older sister of Winfried, a monk of the Raidmount Church. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. She flinched and picked up her feet, but still forced herself to breathe. Evenly deep breaths and slow exhalations helped keep her calm. Quickly hiding the envelope with her notes behind her back, as if cutting it off from other people's eyes, she froze. A moment later, new, heavy knocks were heard, as if someone was insistently breaking into her room. Then, for several seconds, there was a strange rattling sound, like a bunch of keys, or some similar metal object being shaken, clanking in the darkness. The blows came again, even harder and more persistent. It seemed that the stranger was either trying to break the lock or to force Giovinetta to open the door out of fear. The canvas was now being pounded not only with fists, but also with feet. Something cracked, followed by new powerful jolts as the door barely held back the pressure. Giovinetta did not move. Bound as if by a string, she breathed in and out rapidly, trying to contain her panic and shake the fear and trembling anxiety from her consciousness. But her hands trembled so that a brilliant reflection of pain and fear stood in her eyes, and this trembling revealed her condition better than any words. It's a long story. On that dark night, Giovinetta turned to old memories, long since dusted by time. With a heart that had once been wounded by guilt, she wrote a letter about the most terrible of all, Minus Kretschmann. 3 years ago, on that momentous summer day, Giovinetta celebrated her 20th birthday. It was her own birthday, full of expectations and solemn noise. A crowd of guests had gathered in the great hall. People were chatting, breaking into several groups, discussing something lively, and the buzz became even thicker, like a wave of sound rolling along the stone walls. Suddenly, one of the knights opened the heavy door and loudly proclaimed, Eliest, Elwain, Kello, Wardeneten, Olengrin, Delu Ingridern. Achii, part of the eastern and western borders, has been restored, and the count has been exiled to the east. The sound of hooves echoed outside, an unmistakable sign of return. The crowd parted, making way for the horses and their escort. The young lord commanded, "Oh, ha 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 ha," and the gates were immediately opened, allowing him and his men into the bustling expanse of the courtyard. The crowd erupted in cheers. They called him Johannes, the shining son of Waldemar, and the name flew from face to face like a ray at dawn. The lord himself was radiant with the joy of his return. A smile never left his face. He raised his hand in a sign of victory, and laughing, accepted the greetings, as if he shared the triumph with everyone who stood nearby. But as soon as the lord turned to look at the crowd, his gaze involuntarily flew to the highest tower of the castle, where, like a shadow above a stone, Jadovazantiovin, she, fascinated by the spectacle, looked down at the ranks of knights and mounted men who had arrived, watching the horses gallop under the gate. Her beauty was striking. The blonde locks of hair and the green scarf on her shoulders were in amazing harmony with her that day, emphasizing the tenderness of her face. Suddenly, the girl turned sharply and looked at the painting standing next to her bed, as if it demanded an answer. It was on that day that Giovinetta received a portrait of the man she was to marry a second time, something she had not wanted but could not refuse. In the painting, Lord indoctored than her grandfather, as if he were already on the verge of retirement. She involuntarily began to bite her nails, trying to drown out the tension. It was enough to imagine the duties next to this man, and the conversations that could not be avoided, as disgust tightened her face. Lord Indoctedzon was a wealthy and elderly man, without long-standing noble roots. He was the one her father had chosen for her marriage. The old man had for unsuccessful unions under his belt some wives he had thrown out, others had died, and there were harsh words about his harshness. Giovinetta came to her senses, and realized that in her excitement she had bitten the skin on her fingers. Blood was seeping from under her nail. The baking was trivial compared to the torment that gripped her heart every day in this room, under the very sky of the estate. Of course, She did not want to become the wife of such an elderly and unpleasant man, especially since it seemed that her father had deliberately chosen him. To put aside her thoughts of the anxious future for a few hours, Giovinetta drew a curtain over the portrait and began to pace the room, muttering aloud. She said quietly, instead of taking care of his own daughter on my wedding night, he saw in me only a nuisance, covered with terrible gossip. For his father, replenishing the military treasury was of incomparably greater importance. It was clear from everything that the war with Count Tristan would not subside soon. Suddenly there was a knock on the door, and someone called her by her short name Annetta. The timbre was painfully familiar, and Giovinetta recognized it from the first note. Her fingers immediately trembled, her breathing came in rapid, forced gasps. It was Johann. He stopped at the threshold and said, Annetta, it's me, Johann. Sorry, I probably shouldn't have come to the girl's room without warning. Annetta rushed closer to the door, trying not to miss a single syllable that Johann pronounced clearly and evenly. He was silent for a moment, waiting for an answer, but before he could answer, he spoke again. Johann said, I would like to give you something I brought from my trip. Let it remind you of me. After saying this, he carefully placed the scroll on the floor and added in an even voice. Johann said, I will leave it at the door, and went away. When he left, the silence continued for a long time, echoing his footsteps on the stone. Giovinetta listened to each distant glimmer of sound that melted like a wave with each passing moment. Annetta opened the door and saw a small box on the floor, painted in a checkerboard pattern. The black and white squares shimmered in the candlelight, like a silent sign from a distant childhood. Opening the lid, Giovinetta saw the chessman. She immediately recognized the material, carved ivory and obsidian, and a pang of nostalgia, sweet and burning, gripped her heart. It was the same set that he and Johann had once competed in during sleepless nights, inventing their own rules and turning each game into an adventure. She touched the figures and quietly remembered the past. Giovinetta said, when I was 6, my mother locked me in her room. And before that, Johann and I lived in the same room. We ate together, slept together, and grew up together. And at night, we played chess until dawn. Nanny Anna Grisella kept reproaching me that it was not right for girls to take up boys' games. She smiled bitterly, as if seeing a blackboard from the past before her. Giovinetta said, no one could beat Johann, but I challenged him every night. Every week came to me. The joy then was so great that even now it is difficult to put it into words. Slowly rearranging the pieces, one by one, she smiled with each move, but with each touch a whole whirlpool of memories rose, and each memory cut painfully, like the edge of obsidian. Having completed the improvised game, Giovinetta placed two figures side by side, the light one, which in her imagination signified herself, and the black one, which personified the man to whom she was to be married for the second time, and froze for a moment. How did she lose the right to be with her brother, with whom she shared every day of her childhood? Her thoughts took her back to the reasons and steps that later turned into a ban on seeing Johann, like a chain thrown around the closest person. She remembered how she had become a widow on the very first night of her marriage. Her husband had died, and from that moment on she had been given the cruel nickname of the Cursed Lady. At the funeral, Giovinetta tried to understand whether she had truly accepted this fact in her heart, or whether she had merely distanced herself from the pain so as not to break down. Maybe all this is just a layering of human speculation, the inventions of those who did not know the essence, and did not see the picture up close. She saw Johann open the cellar door, freeing his sister from the darkness and dampness, as if he were cutting through the tight silence of the chains with a knife. It was dusk outside. The boy, full of joyful impatience, approached the door and pushed it open, letting in the evening breath of freedom. A bright beam cut into the darkness, and the girl involuntarily squinted. Her eyes, unaccustomed to light, were cut by the glare, but along with it, relief entered her chest. Despite the tangle of rumors and whispers, she was infinitely happy to see her brother. This moment weighed more than any other person's words. Once upon a time, Johann and Giovinetta were as close as anyone else in the world. They were connected by an invisible thread woven from childhood nights and quiet secrets. She clenched her fingers and confessed to herself what she had long been afraid to name. Giovinetta said, I swear, at first I was only moved by curiosity about Kretschmann, but that inappropriate intimacy with my brother was imprinted so deeply in my memory that I pushed her away and hated her. Suddenly, a hand firmly grabbed little Giovinetta's wrist and pulled her sharply to the side, breaking the moment that was already hanging by a thread. It was the mother. Having seen a scene she considered unacceptable, she silently took her daughter away, and the coldness of her determination instantly turned everything around her to stone. The mother's gaze was so fiercely cold and unyielding that her fingers gripped little Giovinnetta's wrist even tighter, like iron hoops, leaving not a shred of room for resistance. Annetta desperately wanted to return to her brother, to take at least one step towards him, but she quickly realized that there was no way back for her. and there would never be one. Meanwhile, Johann stood frozen at the threshold, as if waiting for his sister to speak. He stared confused into the darkness of the corridor, trying to understand what exactly had happened and why she had been taken away. The mother led her daughter higher and higher up the stairs, to the top of the castle, and from the summer when Annetta turned 6, her universe gathered into a single room on the 3rd floor, which became both a home and a lock without a key. The cramped room seemed to get smaller every year, not because the walls were moving, but because Giovinetta herself was growing up quickly, and there was less and less space for dreams in it. The only thing she could look at was the main street that ran beneath the window. She watched this living canvas of the city, as if it were her only window to freedom. Johann, meanwhile, impressed everyone with the accuracy and power of his blows. His training was honed like a blade, and every sparring match was a delight. His teachers unanimously praised him for his rapid mastery of every science and craft, and it seemed that the boy was destined to become a lord by the very course of events. And while he grew in skill, Giovinetta could only helplessly contemplate his figure from the highest window of the estate, where each day merged with the next. All alone, she would sit for hours on the windowsill, leaning out and breathing in the cool breeze. These minutes became for her a brief oblivion, a light cure for her invisible captivity. Eventually, it seemed as if she had been given the right to a new beginning, a chance to break free, get married, and find her own quiet happiness. At least that's what she thought at the time. In the autumn of that year, when she first showed signs of growing up and was 12, Annetta was married to the nephew of the late King Rodrigo the Mighty, a young man 6 years her senior. According to ancient custom, a symbolic marriage bed was placed in the very center of the hall, like an altar, and numerous witnesses gathered around it, eager to evaluate what should not be evaluated. But the humiliation he suffered under the heavy, judgmental gaze seemed a trifle, compared to the bleak loneliness that exhausted Giovinetta after day. She believed that the torment was behind her, and the disturbing dreams would melt away. But just then, incomprehensible things began to happen around her, small disruptions to the usual routine that, for no reason at all, gave rise to a feeling of hidden threat. In the dead of night, she returned to her husband, wanting to simply touch his shoulder, to hug him with the hope of mutual support, because from now on they were family. But suddenly, she felt cold and damp under her palms, which had already soaked the bed. For a moment she was confused, not understanding what exactly had happened, and where this well had come from. In the semi-darkness, under a barely perceptible glow, she looked at her hands and froze in amazement. Bloody spots darken on the skin. The moonlight, filtering through the glass, snatched every detail from the darkness, and endowed the room with the features of a terrible mystery. Looking up, she saw the lifeless body of a man lying heavily on top of her, so distorted that it was scary to look at him. The colors of the world had receded, and a thick silence hung in the air, squeezing her chest with the pain of loss. She looked at her blood-stained fingers again, and shifted her gaze to the motionless body next to her, frozen in silence, and watching the red drops inexorably flow down, as if measuring the new reality of her life. After her husband's death on their wedding night, people gave Giovinetta the insulting nickname Diamond Lady, and whispers of this name lingered in the corridors of her house for a long time. Recalling those terrifying events, she held back her tears with tense stubbornness, so as not to allow the horror to consume her from within again. A maid entered the room and said, "Bowing, Madame, the Grand Duke wishes to see you. He asks you to come down as soon as possible for a conversation." Giovinetta picked up the hem of her dress and quickly moved down the steep, narrow stairs of the old estate, her heels barely touching the stone. Having passed along the corridor, she approached the Duke. He drew his sword and waved it in the air for show, then looked coldly and said, "Have you received the portrait of your fiancé? If you marry him, you will live in peace and prosperity. If you refuse, you will regret it bitterly. So agree and do not resist, because you will only make things worse for yourself." The Grand Duke's gaze seemed sharp and dicey, like a blade penetrating the skin. Only she saw him that way. With his lips pursed in disdain, the Duke muttered through a stuffed mouth, "That man doesn't care about that nasty gossip about you, as long as he has the right to bear the name of Waldemar." Giovinetta lowered her eyes for a moment, but immediately looked up again directly at her father, as if searching for even a spark of mercy in his features. Gathering the last of her courage, she spoke in a barely audible voice. "Giovinetta," she said, "forgive me, father, but I cannot marry him." The father's eyes were frozen with the same cold that froze in the blade of his sword. He sincerely desired to see his daughter married, secure, and free from poverty. But suddenly, she turned sharply, and ran away without finishing. Her eyes filled with moisture, and the shine showed that in a moment the tears would burst. She could not overcome her shame to agree to marry an older man, only because he did not care about her disgraced reputation seemed humiliating. The indignation was so fervent that evening, returning to her room, she seriously considered for the first time asking the demon for help. This demon was passed down through the female line of the Daigo clan. According to legend, one of the ancestors once cut it into 9 parts, and locked each separately in a sarcophagus. Before her death, the mother revealed to her daughter an ancient secret that had been passed down from generation to generation, like a dark key to a closed door. She said that if you make a wish next to the sarcophagus, the demon can grant it. All the men of the 2 Ice Stone clan died in the war, so she was the sole heir to the 9 sarcophagi. Of course, the mother had transported these sarcophagi to Gustav Castle. According to her, 5 had already been used long ago, and only 4 remained untouched. When Giovinetta ran into the large basement, where all 9 were supposed to be, she saw the lid smashed in half as if someone's madness and rage had swept through it like a storm. Although the mother brought all 9 sarcophagi to the castle, only 1 now survives. The rest have turned to stone fragments and dust. Only one part of the demon remained intact. It was still firmly sealed in a lonely sarcophagus that darkened in a corner of the underground hall. It didn't matter to her that out of all 9, only 1 survived. Seized with rage, she grabbed the heavy hammer, and anger swirled in her head, inflamed by thoughts of the old groom. She exclaimed, "War has opened its insatiable mouth only on men, and I, locked in a room for 14 years, have not felt its fury. But the fear of marriage with the gray-haired and doctor-haired Andrividson has blinded me worse than any disaster." Swinging her heavy hammer, Giovanni said, "Sir, demon of the 2 Stone clan, I call out to you, Thuck, stop this. I do not want to marry him." She gathered all her accumulated rage and despair into one single blow, as if releasing years of silent captivity. The next moment, she shattered the last sarcophagus containing the remains of the demon dragon, making a wish to cancel the wedding, as if putting an end to the imposed fate. The stone slabs flew in all directions, and the heavy dust, blown up by the impact, rose in a column, covering the space of the dungeon with a misty curtain. Giovanni whispered, "Terrible Kretschmann, I still remember that moment. If I had thought more wisely, then if I had wished for something more significant, at least the end of the war, perhaps you and my brother would not have suffered such a fate." She raised her eyes to the bright sky that shimmered somewhere above, beyond the cracks of stone and the dust of time. A strange mixture of steam and shining dust rose from the cracks in the wall, rising and melting in the air like ghostly smoke. It was still night outside, and Giovanni, slowly, almost on tiptoe, made her way back to her room. At that very moment, incomprehensible sounds came from Johann's room, as if someone was struggling with himself in a delirium. The man groaned, as if he were in unbearable pain, or drowning in a terrible sleep from which he could not escape. Soon the torment became so intense that his forehead broke out in sweat, his body shook with convulsions. Johann broke out in a scream loud, uncharacteristic of him, so that the servants and guards became alert. Something inside him was cracking, as if bones were breaking, and the screams became more and more piercing, like a cry for help. A few minutes earlier, Giovanetta, holding a small candle, had been leisurely ascending the stairs to her room, protecting the flame from drafts. She was in no hurry. The castle was asleep, and no one was to see or hear her return. Suddenly, there was a scream that cut through her soul, like a sharp blade. The pain in her chest responded with the same sharpness. The scream was so eerie that she didn't immediately realize who it belonged to. It all sounded like a night attack, although there was no sound of battle around. To make sure, she looked out the window, but saw no enemies under the walls, no signs of a fight, only an empty courtyard. The birds did not stop chirping, and the darkness outside the window was so thick that even if you shot them in the eye, the darkness would still send chills down to your bones. Suddenly the maid ran in, and catching her breath, rushed to her with an excited whisper. She said, "Madam, I have been looking for you everywhere. It is dangerous here. Mean to return to your room quickly." Giovanni stepped closer to Grisella, and asked sharply, almost abruptly. She said, "Grisella, what is this shouting? Has the County of Tristan attacked Castle Gustav?" Grisella shook her head, urging her not to delay. She said, "No way, madame, you really should return to your rooms at once." The anxiety only grew, and Giovanetta asked with firm insistence. She said, "Then what are these voices? Who is crying so desperately?" She knew that Grisella was a man of few words, and the heavy, oppressive pause between them only made the anxiety more acute. Returning to her room, Giovanetta was unable to distract herself from the eerie screams that continued to pierce the night. With each passing minute, the screams became sharper, louder, as if they were gathering strength from the darkness and piercing the walls. Unable to bear it any longer, the girl decided to peek in to see what was going on. People were already crowding around Johann's room. Maids, guards, servants, and several soldiers. The knights gave orders, demanding that everyone move towards Johansson's room, and the crowd obediently crowded into the narrow corridor. She wondered why such a force of men and weapons had gathered at his door, and what could have happened in the middle of the night to make such a commotion. As she approached, the scream grew in a wave, and Giovinetta, winced from the pain in her ears, as if the sharp sound had ripped through her veins. She peered into the narrow opening and was instantly stunned by what she saw, feeling a chill run down her spine. Several knights held Johann by the arms and legs. One had a rag over his mouth. He was being tied with coarse straps, and there was chaos all around: broken furniture, an overturned shield, a thrown sword. And then Giovinetta that the source of that hellish cry was not the enemy's attack, but Johann himself, the heir to the house of Waldemar. Grisella jumped up to her and pleaded excitedly. She said, "Madam, please, let's go. Go back to your room, please." But Giovinetta, as if she had grown old, did not take her eyes off the crack. Grisella burst into a scream. Trying to reason with her, she said, "This is a common assault, madam. Go back to your place." Giovinetta glanced back at the maid, who quickly added, as if to justify the endless shouting. She said, "Battle is a cruel thing. It leaves scars, not only on the body but also on the soul. On sleepless nights the pain returns." The young lord had fought on the front lines since he was a child, so it was only a matter of time. But Giovinetta could not understand how what was bursting from his chest and resounding like a cry from the abyss could be called a temporary fit. She had once seen what a real attack looked like and had something to compare it to, without embellishment or legends. It was a young squire who fainted from unbearable heat and exhaustion right in the middle of the courtyard. His body was convulsing, his hands were shaking in convulsions, and his eyes were rolling. It was hard to look the spectacle in the eye. The picture at that time seemed to her like a broken doll, tangled in threads. She sincerely pitied the boy, writhing on the ground, not in control of his own body. That was what, in her opinion, a real attack looked like. So how could it be compared to Johann's nightly, incessant cries, to this despair that tore through stone and heart? The screams did not subside until dawn, and Giovinetta, sitting under the window on the cold floor, silently prayed that this terrible cacophony would finally die down. Asked herself softly, searching for an answer in the darkness. Giovinetta said, "Is it the memories of the horrors of war that are tearing him apart so much from within?" Such a cheerful man, who had been awarded the title of lord, was now suffering and screaming without ceasing. Was everything really so terrible? And would he be able to escape from this captivity? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden gust of wind, and the only candle in the room went out, leaving only the smell of burning and the dark stain of night. The girl shuddered. It became eerie from the very suddenness, from the silence that instantly thickened around her. Soon there was complete silence. The screams ceased, and the voice that had just torn her thoughts no longer echoed from any corner of the castle. She did not yet know that all the guards who were called to guard her peace had disappeared somewhere, as if dissolving into thin air without a trace. She whispered into the void, as if addressing an invisible enemy. Giovinetta said, "I think this is also part of your plan, Kretschmann. You always calculated everything, and I still regret what I did." As the day drew to a close and the corridors became empty, she ventured to go to her brother's room, to find out how he was feeling after the night's storm. Carefully, almost silently, she knocked on the wooden door, fearing that stronger knocks would attract unnecessary attention from the knights. Inetta knocked twice more and answered. Lowering her voice, she said, "Johann, it's me, Inetta." In response, there was an obsessive silence, and with a sigh, she gathered her thoughts to speak further, without waiting for permission. Clutching the lantern tighter, she confessed through the door quietly and frankly. Inetta said, "This is the first time I've stood at your door since I got married." The deaf silent woman did not give way, so she added even more sincerely, almost pleadingly. Inetta said, "Johann, I am worried about you. Please, at least say a word." Instead of an answer, the distant echo of footsteps echoed in the corridor, the soft thump of soles on stone, most likely someone from the night watch. Giovinetta immediately guessed who was approaching, and her heart sank with the anxiety that ran like a chill over her skin. The guard was coming straight here. She thought about running downstairs or returning to her chambers, but both paths seemed blocked. It was too late to retreat, and the girl prepared for the worst, resigned to the fact that she might receive a severe reprimand for wandering around the castle at night. But suddenly, someone's hand grabbed her wrist sharply and pulled her towards him. Giovinetta shuddered all over and barely held back a scream, biting her lip in surprise. Turning around, she recognized her savior. Johann stood before her, and this realization struck her chest with warmth and anxiety at the same time. The door behind suddenly clicked and closed tightly, and Giovinetta, unnoticed by anyone, found herself inside her brother's room without any suspicion from the guard. The guard walked down the corridor at an even pace, not suspecting anything and not even catching the rustle with which the girl slipped into Johann's room. She tripped and fell on her brother, and the lantern crunched painfully against the stone. Almost at the same moment, the doorknob shook and the iron clanged fiercely against the wood. Johann and Giovinetta came so close together that she felt her heart pounding. It had been years since her hand had last touched her brother's. Inetta clutched his shirt convulsively, and his bare chest appeared right before her eyes. This closeness confused her, more than the dull knock on the door. She did not immediately understand what had caused her trembling, the fear of being discovered by the guard, or the sudden jolt that had knocked her off her feet and deprived her of support. She looked up at Johann. He seemed embarrassed by all this confusion and didn't know where to start. Tears welled up in Annetta's eyes. Childhood memories came flooding back, and she sobbed softly, trying not to burst into tears. She remembered her brother, that lively, cheerful little boy with whom she had grown up, sharing every day and every little thing. The memory flashed through her mind as she hugged him by the shoulders, catching every smile, every word, every timid gesture of tenderness that seemed natural and simple at the time. They were mischievous together, laughing and making up pranks without ceasing, and the world was too small for their inventions. She felt again the childish joy that had once united them. The embrace after so many years touched her to the core, and her heart seemed about to leap out of her chest. From the surge of emotions, she froze for several minutes, like a petrified statue, not daring to move or say a single word. She exclaimed, "Johann!" But her smile instantly faded, as if she had been swept away by an invisible hand. The next moment, weakness swept over her in waves. He almost fainted from his sharp cry that cut through the silence. Johann shouted, "What's?" He leaned closer and hissed, almost in a whisper, but harshly. Johann said, "What are you doing? Do you understand what will happen if anyone finds out you're here?" Annetta was confused for a moment, not understanding what he was leaning towards, and what exactly he was afraid of. She raised her eyebrows indignantly and blurted out sharply, suppressing the trembling in her voice. Giovinetta said, "I came because I was worried about you. You screamed so much last night that I could barely stand it. I know you weren't expecting me, but that's no reason to snap at me," she added even more firmly, without looking away. Giovinetta said, "I saw how the knights held you, how they forcibly pushed you away. Did you think for a moment how scary it was for you?" He answered almost inaudibly, his jaw clenched. Johann said, "Annetta, you must go back to your room. Please go." When she asked him to look her in the eye, he recoiled and slurred his words. Johann said, "Enough of this worry. I'm fine, you hear?" He finished briefly, as if giving an order. Johann said, "It is not becoming of you to wander around the castle in the middle of the night without Grisella. Return immediately." These words pierced her heart painfully. Her sincere concern and warmth seemed to be dismissed as if it mattered nothing, but she was not going to back down. She said, "I will go, but only if you lead me." Johann growled in annoyance. He said, "Stop your foolish antics. What is the matter with you today? Why are you so stubborn?" He stood up, staggering, and, trying to keep his balance, grabbed his back with his hand, as if he were burning with invisible fire. In a low voice, through gritted teeth, he uttered a rebuke. Johann said, "This is too much. You shouldn't go into the men's room at night." Suddenly, beads of sweat appeared on his forehead, as if he had just covered a long distance. His breathing became heavy and ragged, as after a grueling workout. Her brother's words, her turkeys Giovinetta, felt superfluous, unnecessary, just when she had come to support him. Gathering herself, she lifted her chin and answered firmly. Annetta said, "Yes, I went down by myself, but you dragged me into your room." Johann's breathing became increasingly heavy, his movements jerky, as if his body was losing control of its will. He grunted in a low voice, trying to justify his abruptness. Johann said, "What else could I do but drag you inside? If the guards saw you at night near the men's room, can you imagine the consequences?" She flared up with indignation and snapped at the top of her voice. "Giovinetta, so down TTVOA." For the first time all evening, something disturbing flashed across his face, a shadow that made her shudder inwardly. Always smiling even during his campaigns, he now looked at her with a mad gleam in his pupils, and a real cold fear woke in Annetta. She pressed her lips tightly together, trying not to show the trembling in her fingers and to keep her voice even. She whispered almost penitently, as if seeking a bridge of reconciliation. Annetta said, "Forgive me, Johann." Johann? Lowering her head, she felt bitter disappointment. She had come to support him, but instead she had only irritated him and stirred up his wounds. Johann was silent. This silence was more eloquent than reproaches. It seemed that his sister's stubbornness had finally thrown him off balance and shaken his already fragile peace. He interrupted the conversation in a sharp tone. Johann said, "Enough of this childishness. Giovinetta Waldemar." And at that moment, his palms trembled as if an invisible heat had awakened in them. Suddenly, his body began to convulse. His entire body shook, as if a powerful bolt of lightning had passed through him, burning away his strength and will to resist. Johann fell to the floor. Gasping for air, he writhed in pain, as if he were suffocating, searching for even a tiny breath between attacks. Giovinetta was frightened to the point of numbness. She did not understand what was happening to him, and why the pain was tearing him apart so mercilessly. She wanted to help, but fear froze her movements. He burst into a scream, pushing her away with his words. Johann shouted, "Rest, "Don't come closer, Inetta. Stay away." A terrible crunching sound swept over him, bones cracking like dry branches under a boot, and the skin over his eyes darkened, as if a shadow had touched it. The sight was horrible. It seemed as if something was breaking him from within. His body moved in waves, his teeth lengthened into sharp fangs, and his nails turned into strong, sharp claws. The clothes could not withstand the onslaught of change. The fabric was cracking and tearing, and Giovinetta stood stunned, not knowing where to throw herself. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to protect herself from the piercing moan and dry crackling that ran through her insides like a cold. She whispered, barely audible, gasping for breath with terror. Giovinetta said, amidst these screams and the cracking of bones, through the muffled groans, "Nothing remains of my blue-seed brother Johann." Something unmanly appeared before her, a creature with horns and giant wings that barely fit in the stone space. She understood without words. In front of her was a demon. This gigantic monster could sweep her off the face of the earth with one movement, leaving no trace of her presence. Their eyes met, and her body became frozen. She could not even move a finger. Gathering the last of her strength, she clutched the hem of her dress, preparing to rush for the door before the chance was gone. Giovinetta ran away, without looking back or allowing herself any unnecessary thoughts. The monster reacted with lightning speed. Fire flared in its eyes, and it opened them wide with mad fury, as if aiming for prey. She could feel his gaze on her, wild and predatory, although somewhere deep down, her brother might still be smoldering. It was no longer Johann who stood before her. He desperately reached for the latch, trying to grab the metal and not miss her chance at salvation. Gathering her last strength, she tugged at the door. It opened, and she rushed into the long dark corridor, swallowing the air in big gulps, as if after a storm. Suddenly a giant shadow glided overhead, cutting through the air and hanging over her like the black wing of a storm. It was the demon's paw. It slammed the door shut with a thud, cutting off Giovinnetta's escape route, and even depriving him of a ghostly chance of salvation. She became stiff with fear, as if bound by invisible chains, and stood silent, unable to move or raise her voice. The monster's tail slid around her shins, barely touching, as if enjoying her helplessness and fear. At that moment, her mother's words came to her, like an echo of an old admonition. Her mother said, "Inetta, those sarcophagi that hold the demons still have the power to grant wishes." She then added as seriously as ever, "Mother said, but remember, the wish will come true, but the consequences will be terrible and distorted." Her voice was solemn and sober. She was trying to protect her daughter from the temptation to approach the forbidden with even one touch. And it was this warning that now pierced her memory, the one she had so frivolously ignored. She replayed in her head her own screaming words from that night. Giovinetta had shouted, "I don't want to marry him." Only now did she understand. She should have asked for something else, the death of the old man on their wedding night, so that the sentence would not cast a shadow over everyone. But the wish came out vague, and the demon will take advantage of this vagueness, turn everything to his own advantage. He leaned so close that his gaze, heavy and ominous, seemed to pierce her chest, and she suddenly felt clearly he was ready to kill her just to break up this marriage. She gritted her teeth and spoke in a barely audible voice to the invisible executioner of customs. Giovinetta said, "Do you know, Kretschmann, what awaits a noblewoman who is accused of debauchery? First, her hair will be cut off, she will be stripped naked, and then she will be mounted on a black stallion, and a servant will lead her through the streets to the mockery of the crowd." She added, almost breathlessly, describing the cruelty of human judgment. Giovinetta said they would throw stones at her until her body was covered with wounds. Sometimes women could not bear the shame and the poverty and broke their minds. Such people were subject to exile, to a convent or exile, where they would live out their lives in solitude, forever etched in people's memory as disgraced. Therefore, she had no right to make a sound. If she screamed, the guards would burst in, find her in the men's room in the middle of the night, and the sentence would be pronounced without words. She thought those years of solitude were already torture. How will I endure the cloistered captivity? How could she endure the public humiliation of being paraded through the city on a black stallion? And how could she atone for the guilt that her reckless desire had turned the heir of the Waldemars into something inhuman? Every breath of the demon knocked her off her feet. Her knees buckled, the world floated, and she barely held on to keep from fainting. The guards would destroy such a Johann without hesitation. Who would believe her if she ran out and screamed that this monster was her brother? She knew that it was her vague desire that had allowed the demon to enter Johann, and now he could destroy her without realizing it. The most terrible thing was something else, that her brother would never return. The demon wrapped itself around her with superhuman strength, almost tenderly, and something snapped sharply in her neck with the last of her voice. Through the pain and darkness, she whispered, "Johann. Johann." When her grip loosened for a moment, she raised her head to meet his eyes, as as if trying to discern at least a spark of recognition in the depths of his pupils. He breathed heavily into her face, deep, ragged breaths with a low growl, never taking his eyes off hers. Giovinetta held her breath, waiting for the pain that seemed to be coming in the next moment. She held on with all her might, trying to concentrate and not panic. Somewhere in the depths of her soul, there was a smoldering hope that her brother would come to his senses, remember her, take pity, and give her a chance to save herself. And just then, as the thought flashed through his mind, the demon suddenly sank to the floor. His wings flapped heavily behind him, as if they had lost the power to keep him aloft. The monster's body twitched. It was thrown in convulsions, as if a devastating electric discharge had passed through it. When the attack subsided, Giovinetta realized that this was her only option. She quietly closed the door to the room where her brother had once lived and where the demon now lurked, and ran away as fast as she could. She knew the way to her chambers better than anyone. Her footsteps struck a dull rhythm on the stone, and although she understood the risk of being noticed, fear whispered that speed was her most faithful ally. Behind, from the open door, a strange haze of smoke crept up. It seemed to be reaching for her, trying to catch up, but Giovanni faster than her own shadow. Breathing hard, she saw only one thing before her: the door to her own room. All her will was narrowed to this goal, and she had to make it. As she rushed inside and slammed the door, she felt her heart pounding despite the echo in her temples. A brief sense of relief flashed in her chest. She was home. With the same tension, she slammed the door shut and settled beneath it, sliding down in a powerless wave, as if the tree itself could stop the beast if it appeared again. She smiled bitterly and whispered to herself, "Giovinetta, to feel safe in the room that has been my prison for 14 years. Several long minutes passed. Breathing slowly even out, the trembling did not leave, but the sharpest panic receded, giving way to a muffled calm. But as soon as the wave of fear had dried up, a bitter thought entered my brain. One thing worries. My brother has been consumed by a demon. How is he now? Did I really leave his body behind? As if I had taken his life myself? It's too cruel." She clung to the belief that Johann was still alive, that in the depths of this curse, he had preserved a crumb of himself and would someday return whole, as he was firm, purposeful, with a dream of becoming the best warrior in his army. Giovinetta could not help but reproach herself for everything that had happened. Not only had she kissed her brother in front of her mother, and been forbidden to even speak to him, with her reckless desire, she had condemned him to a demonic brand, making him a creature capable of killing with a single movement. She cried quietly, soundlessly, as if she wanted to wash away the pain from her heart with tears that flowed incessantly and burned her cheeks. She clenched her fists and thought resolutely. Giovinetta said, "If I summon the demon, I'll fix it." And, treading carefully, she went down to her brother's room again, opened the door, and peered through the narrow crack. Finally, she stepped inside. The demon lay there, in the same position, still and silent. She did not understand why he did not move, but this frozen silence worked for her. She did not dare to approach close. Despite her frozen wings, fear did not recede. This creature was 3 times her size, and even in its stillness demanded extreme caution from her, because she had no right to be thoughtless. Finally, she whispered cautiously, as if testing her own thoughts. "Giovinetta said he hardly wants to harm me. He himself barely breathes. His eyelids barely move. What kind of death is this?" "Ah," she added, trying to push away the panic with reason. Giovinetta said, "And besides, he didn't try to kill me even when he had countless opportunities. Maybe his goal is something else entirely?" She timidly approached and crouched down next to him, forcing herself not to tremble, as if suppressing her fear with willpower. Sitting down on the cold stone, she looked intently at the creature, and asked in an even voice. Giovinetta said, "Have you really come at my call, demon? Who are you really?" Suddenly, something thudded against the floor. The demon flinched, frightened by the sound. At that moment, he looked not like a predator, but like a confused child. She looked around, saw the reason, and smiled involuntarily. Giovinetta said, "That's your tail, you fool! How can you be afraid of your own tail?" The demon slowly raised its head, glanced at its tail, and fell heavily face down again, exhaling as deeply as if it were its last breath. All this time he had been watching her. Perhaps he was appreciating her, or perhaps he simply wanted to be near her without any intention of attacking, and somewhere inside this shell, perhaps Johann's soul was still simmering warm, familiar, dear. She silently stared into his face, trying to catch even a shadow of aggression. Whether it was still there had already faded. With each passing moment, she saw more clearly not a monster but an exhausted, defenseless creature. This thought gave her courage like a breath of air. She decided to call out to him quietly, but persistently. Giovinetta said, "Hey, demon, can you hear me? Let's run away from here together." He looked up at her, and she hastily threw out an argument. Giovinetta said, "If they see you here, they will destroy us both. Let's escape, at least not far. The main thing is to get away from this place." Without waiting for an answer, she persuaded even more gently. Giovinetta said, "It's hard for you to go alone, isn't it? I'll help, just please don't hurt me." Giovinetta reached out, and took his huge paw almost as big as her hand, and pulled him very carefully toward the door. as if testing the limits of what was possible. But after just a few steps, it became clear it was a futile endeavor. He was too heavy, at least a cart would have been needed to carry him to the threshold. Suddenly, the floor seemed to slope, stepping on the hem of her dress. She slipped and fell with her whole body, the blow penetrating to her bones. Hitting her nose, she winced in pain and whispered a curse in her heart against the day. She had summoned the demon. Now she had to not only distrust a creature capable of instant death but also endure the throbbing pain of a broken nose. Gathering herself, she exclaimed in irritation, almost anger. Giovinetta, hey demon, if you understand human language, move a little. What did you come here for? I thought you were capable of anything, she added, not hiding her annoyance. Giovinetta said, but you can't even take a step, you can barely breathe. Pressed by his weight against the cold stone, she muttered hoarsely, trying not to give in. Giovinetta said, now is not the time to lie down and give up. We must flee or we will both perish. Do you know anything, or are you a complete fool? One of her fingers was tightly wrapped in a bandage and throbbed painfully, reminding her of itself with every heartbeat. But despite this, Giovinetta first tried to bring down the demon. There were things much more important than her own pain. Oh, Giovinetta Waldemar, if you're going to call someone a failure, then first of all call yourself one. This thought, voiced in a fit of rage about the demon, will soon turn into a bitter lesson and a complete epiphany for her. Without skill, without strength, fit only to be exchanged for lands and gold, she had never achieved anything on her own, and it became clear that it was not the demon who was clumsy, it was she herself. She bowed her head and confessed in a barely audible voice. Giovinetta said, I have neither the skill nor the courage to flee. This is what my first attempt to appeal to ancient evil proved. Now she had no idea what to do. They could be captured at any moment. Ahead was shame on a black stallion, and the laughter of the capital, stones from the crowd. Is this the price for summoning a demon? Maybe she could still save herself, leave Johann and disappear, where she would not be found. But something in her did not allow her to disown her brother. A silent tear rolled down her cheek, as if a sign of all the pain she had endured, and suddenly the demon reached out a paw and carefully wiped the moisture from her face. An unexpected movement, but there was a strange, gentle calming in it, as if the creature was trying to support her in its own way. Inetta looked up and met his eyes, searching there for at least a spark of the former light. The demon leaned closer and barely, almost weightlessly, touched her lips, more of a shadow of a kiss than an overt movement, like a breath of wind that only marks its presence. She imagined a balcony. She stood behind the snow-white, light curtains and looked at Johann, as if through a haze of a hot day. The air to the house of Waldemar shone like the midday sun. He laughed and rejoiced as his friends splashed water on him, escaping the heat. That cloudless smile was so sincere that Giovinetta saw in it the same carefree childhood moments that she had held on to for all 14 years, as if for her last breath of air. And it all ended with a single kiss. She was locked within four walls, condemned to the silence and darkness of the chambers, and Johann no less guilty than she continued on his victorious path ere, the pride of Gustav Castle, his ease and success cut her heart, as if reality itself were mocking her. He stood barefoot, shirtless, wearing only light pants, like most young men, and glanced for a moment at her window. But she had already hidden behind the transparent curtains. He barely nodded in her direction and returned to his business as if nothing had happened. When he turned away, she slowly emerged from behind the curtains, approached the windowsill, and spoke softly. Giovinetta said, I envy the freedom that has been taken away from me. Looking at Johann, she whispered with pain and sincerity. Giovinetta said, there is a special bond between us. I love him like a brother, and I love him like a husband who will never be mine. Her heart was filled with love for him, and at the same time burned with burning jealousy to waves beating against each other inside. Thus, the pain accumulated over the years clouded her vision and distorted her thoughts, like a thin lens that changes the shape of the world until it becomes unbearably distorted. She was ready to go to extreme 7 to more to less and to once again touch the same burning moment of feeling that burned in her memory. She mentally confessed to herself, the one who could not belong to me, whom I was afraid to even dream of, so radiant, so bright, Count Waldemar. I loved him, and at the same time envied him. The creature, who only resembled Johann, touched her lips with a barely perceptible, timid kiss. Giovinetta looked at the demon, and for the first time the terror melted away. He did not seem scary to her, as if a shadow had retreated. On the contrary, she was filled with a strange sense of power, as if she could command this gigantic monster. The monster that devoured Johanna behaved submissively despite its demonic appearance. It did not resist her will. Giovinetta reached out, stroked him gently, and smiled right into his face, feeling neither threat nor fear, only quiet warmth. She allowed herself to bask for a moment in this warmth, which she had been deprived of for years, and did not notice how the air between them suddenly changed to one of tension. The demon easily lifted her into his arms and carried her to the opposite corner of the room, holding her firmly but carefully, as if afraid of hurting her. Once there, She slowly felt herself falling from his arms, not yet understanding what exactly was happening and where it was leading. The chaos of events seemed absurd. She let out a cry of confusion, but quickly pulled herself together and covered her face so as not to attract the guards. The price of carelessness was too high. She didn't even have time to blink an eye when the exhausted creature suddenly took on a gentleness, almost humanly domestic and attractive, though its body still remained demonic. His hands, tail, and heavy body were too close. The touch confused her. Her thoughts became confused. Reality slipped away like water through her fingers. She put her palms against him and pushed him away, exhaling with a gasp. Johann said, "Why? Why are you doing this?" But her biggest mistake was meeting his gaze, direct, piercing, like a blade. At that moment, the memory of the words spoken before breaking the last sarcophagus flashed back like a seal removed too late. She then burst into a scream, and every word was pounding in her chest with rage. Giovinetta said, "I don't want." That exclamation was filled with years of suppressed anger and despair, as if she had been preparing an explosion within herself for a long time, revenge on all who had made her a prisoner in her own home. But the real explosion occurred in her heart, precisely when they spoke again about marriage. The decision was impulsive, almost unconscious, but with all her soul she refused to accept an alliance with the old man. And it was at this very moment that it suddenly dawned on her what a fatal consequence her desire had caused, and how far everything had gone because of one reckless appeal to a dark power. Inetta suddenly understood the demon's move. Her request was ridiculously simple, not to become the old man's wife. She begged for an end to this, and the demon fulfilled the request, but in its own twisted way, substituting a dangerous means for a noble goal. She looked away, unable to bear the sight of the consequences of her own recklessness, now embodied in this likeness, breathing and moving beside her, like the embodied answer to her unreasonable desire. She covered her face with her hands, as if she wanted to hide from herself from the imprint of guilt in this monster, which had become the living seal of her mistake. Suddenly, the demon leaned too close, and a cold, uncontrollable touch near her ear made her shudder, as if from an unexpected whisper. Then he whispered, as if remembering her own words. The demon said, "That's what you said. Please put an end to this." Giovinetta turned her head. The demon was looming over her, baring his sharp teeth in a predatory smile. But in a moment something changed in his gaze, as if a shadow had receded and a ray had broken through it. She shouldn't have looked him straight in the eyes. He knew it, but it was too late. Eyes heavenly, pure, painfully familiar, as if from ancient times, deep, full of unbearable pain. That's exactly what Johann had. Something human, close, recognizable still burned in them. She drowned in those pupils and did not want to emerge. Johann's eyes became a key, a lever, a thread that held her here, and did not let go. With a trembling hand, she took the demon by the chin and slowly raised his face to hers, as if trying to discern the trace of her brother there. Then she kissed him. Memories flashed in her head like sparks, fragments of tenderness, crumbs of care, the trembling warmth of that forbidden kiss with Johann, which paved the way to the abyss. For this is precisely what you desired, Giovinetta, for Johann to turn to you with his heart, to crave your presence, tenderly and with all his soul, to belong only to you. The demon's body hung over her. She did not take her eyes off him and kissed him, closing her eyes and imagining her brother there. But suddenly, a sharp movement tore the fabric at the seams, exposing the skin on her thigh, and only then did it dawn on her that the boundaries were disappearing. She was dreaming of oblivion. She wanted to become everything to Johann, the world and the air, the first feeling and the last memory. To live by him and think about him, it was madness, and yet she saw no sin in it. And it was then that she heard her name first once, then again. Again, she shouted back, and at that moment, the room burst into light, as if someone had opened the day in the middle of the night. Giovinetta, in her own bed consciousness, emerged slowly. She looked around the familiar walls, not immediately understanding whether what had happened was a dream or reality. Sunlight filtered through her eyelids, forcing her to open her eyes and face the morning without the protection of darkness. And then the memory struck sharply. That dream returned with all its burden and colors. She stood up abruptly, and a flash of light flashed through her mind. She was kissing Johann. In the body of a demon she felt the touch of his lips, while an alien restored her clothes, blurring the line between fear and longing. Looking around, she whispered in a barely audible voice, as if afraid to awaken reality. Giovinetta said, "I woke up in my room, and strangely enough, my dress and underwear were intact. But," she added quietly, as if afraid to disturb the morning silence, Giovinetta said, as if everything that happened last night was just a dream that melted away with the first ray. Jumping out of bed, she rushed downstairs. She absolutely had to make sure whether the demon had really disappeared, or whether it was just a ghost of a disturbing imagination. But the room turned out to be empty. Johann was nowhere to be found, and panic gripped his chest. Had he fled in demonic form, or perhaps had he perished altogether in an unknown battle? Grisella warned her in an anxious voice. Grisella said, "Madame, come back back, this may have consequences. But Annette suddenly saw Johann himself at the window and realized that he was an ordinary man before her, not a monster. Hope flared up in her heart, and she thought maybe it really was a dream. Relief slowly spread with warmth. If it was a ghost of the night, it had not done anything irreparable. Bewildered, Annette rushed to her brother and embraced him, as if seeking to regain a simple family intimacy. "You thought my happiness was boundless." She held back her excitement, and Johann stood stunned, and then appeared Winfried, their younger brother, Winston Sordi, a monk of the Church of Red Ems. Winfried smiled and said, "Is that you, sister?" Winfried had been a weak child, bookish and dreamy. He had gone to a monastery to find his way, but now he was returning because of his own difficulties. Johann explained that his brother had arrived yesterday morning, and had since locked himself in the library, as if searching for answers between the pages. Giovinetta remembered yesterday Johann's return from the front, the portrait of her fiancé being handed to her, the cruel congratulations on your second marriage, and the joy instantly shattered. Desires flashed through her thoughts again, the name of the demon to thy stone, the image of Johann turning into a monster, and her own forbidden longing, stubbornly intertwined with reality. The burden of guilt proved too heavy, and Giovinetta fainted. Johann picked her up in his arms and carried her to his own room, holding her carefully and firmly. He was worried like a brother, but the thought involuntarily slipped further, whether there was something more between them. At that very moment Grisella rushed into the room with anxiety. Grisella said, "And what if they find out?" Johann calmly replied, "Everything will be fine, if you and Winfried keep quiet." Grisella and Winfried nodded. Johann asked the younger one to leave them alone, but the maid could not stand it. Grisella said, "She is engaged. The wedding is just around the corner." Mine's anxiety rang in every word. Winfried gently but firmly took Grisella by the hand and whispered. Winfried said, "How dare you contradict the Lord?" He led her out the door, carrying out his brother's will, while Johann remained in the room by Giovinetta's side, carefully guarding her sleep. Winfried and Grisella were still holding hands as they walked away from the door. He smiled crookedly, and forcing her to look up, grumbled half-jokingly. Winfried said, "Aren't all the women in the castle nervous today?" He leaned down and touched her lips with a brief kiss, without closing his eyes, and Grisella sighed heavily, confused and excited by this unexpected closeness. Winfried put her back to the wall, but his voice remained soft, without pressure. Winfried whispered, "Take care of me." Grisella answered quietly and confused. Grisella said, "We can't." Meanwhile, Johann, alone with his thoughts, remembered his father's frivolous hobbies, and looked at his sister, afraid of his own feelings, whether they went beyond brotherly concern. He did not take his eyes off Giovinnetta's pale face, her hair scattered on the pillow, her trembling eyelashes, her lips. His hand involuntarily reached out to her, but he stopped, amazed at how far his thoughts had taken him. He clenched his fist, as if to quench the excess heat within him. Everyone knew about their previous kiss, after which she had been locked away. 14 years of silence and shame. Johann sat down next to her, and waited patiently for her to open her eyes. Giovinnetta's breathing quickened, and she came to. He did not immediately notice this, until he heard his name spoken from her lips. Surprised, he leaned closer. Johann said, "Annetta, you're awake. How do you feel?" She lowered her eyes, filled with shame, and whispered, as if it were a secret, "Giovinetta, those blue eyes, the eyes of the man I loved. And even though I'm scared, I had to know the truth." Gathering her courage, she dared to ask a direct question, and her voice trembled but did not break. "Giovinetta, do you remember what happened last night?" Her defenseless face painfully touched his heart, stirring something old and fragile. The pulse in his temples squeezed his head like an iron hoop, but the real pain was in his awareness. Perhaps she had touched her brother's lips. The memory of that kiss, and his blue eyes did not fade, and Johann, clenching his jaw, seethed with anger that could hardly be contained in silence. He looked hard, barely holding back his irritation, and the accusation burst out. Johann said, "Annetta, how could you be so ruthless?" His fingers clenched into a fist, trembling, and he added through gritted teeth, "You have no idea how humiliating it all was yesterday." She did not understand why he saw only his own pain. Ignoring her shame and fear, the insult shot out in her words like an arrow. Giovinetta said, "Are you humiliated? How can you say that? It was a blow that could have broken me completely." She reproached him for his narcissism, emphasizing that both of them were partly to blame for this drama. He answered quietly and dryly, as if from a wall. Johann said, "It was the first time for you, not for me. I hope you understand." He lowered his gaze and whispered, as if confessing to excessive harshness. Johann said, "I know. I frightened you with my appearance." She burst into a scream, unable to hold back. Giovinetta said, "Have you gone mad? Have you really lost your mind?" Tears flashed in her eyes, and her voice broke into a desperate reproach. Giovinetta said, have you no shame? Are you not afraid of the punishment of heaven? Do you think you can do as you please, because they call you the radiance of Waldemar? Is that why you did not hear me? He did not understand what she meant, for he did not remember her pleas to stop. She raised her voice, the desperation in the words ringing like a bell. Giovinetta, he said. Yes, I begged you to stop. I begged you, he hastily denied, not believing her version. Johann said, you say you begged, but I was just standing at the door while the knights held me back. Her heart sank. The memory, like a cold, returned. She had indeed stood still, watching him being held and broken now. She understood what it was he had called humiliation, and why that standing like a stone yesterday had come between them. Tears slowly rolled down her cheeks. She wanted to hide from herself in the world, but shame pursued her relentlessly, and she felt that a greater burden could not be imagined. Devoured, I will be the only one left to bear this sin. She was sickened by her own helplessness, and had already taken a step to run away, but his voice stopped her. Johann said, Inetta, did you have to call me crazy? She looked away and replied gently, it's not your fault, Johann. In a whisper, as if confessing, she added words of reconciliation. Giovinetta, I misunderstood. You have nothing to apologize for. She went out into the corridor, and, as if in a curse, repeated, Johann is not guilty. I am Lady Demon. And just then a hand suddenly gripped her wrist. Johann stood before her, and a dull fire burned in his eyes. The warmth of that gaze painfully reminded her of childhood, but she had to retreat in self. She pulled her hand away and saw helpless despair in his pupils. For a moment a look of disgust flashed in her eyes, but it was not hatred, rather disbelief. She whispered firmly, as if she were condemning herself. Giovinetta said, you are Gustav Sayer, and I am the widow. We are two different, Johann. Anger trembled in her words and wet eyelashes. Giovinetta shed, why always me? Why do I have to suffer? Without explaining anything, she ran out of the room, wiping the tears that burned her cheeks with her palm, hided under a rose bush, as if seeking shelter, and whispered to herself, I fell for Johann. For someone who doesn't remember anything, I'm guilty, and there's no one to talk to. In her thoughts, her own stain contrasted with his imagined purity. The questions stung like thorns. Did the demon still live in Johanna? Would he return again? Her hands trembled with both fear and disgust with herself, and she still didn't understand why his absence hurt so much. His gaze fell on the things scattered in the grass, women's clothes, evidently Grisella's. Why were they left out in the open? Meanwhile, Winfried sat in the room, lighting a thin cigarette, and the maid asked quietly, Grisella said, why have you returned, Mr. Winfried? He blew out smoke and answered with calm determination, as if he had decided everything long ago. Winfried said, do you think I was expelled for a prank? No, I came back deliberately. I came across something interesting in the Forbidden X. It's time to check it out. She shivered with curiosity. Grisella said, what exactly did you find there? Pulling on his shirt and trousers, he nodded, holding a cigarette in his teeth, and explained the essence of the discovery. Winfried said there were no direct names, but I am sure everything leads to the maternal lineage, and the demon to stone. The shattered sarcophagus and an old childhood memory that now suddenly acquired a threatening meaning surfaced in his memory. By the damp bricks of the fireplace, Giovinetta and Johann were moving their pieces with concentration. He always had the advantage, as if the heat in the hearth itself was on his side. Johann smiled. Inetta, are you ready to give up? Inetta replied, stubbornly touching her queen. Wait, I'm still thinking. Johann laughed lightly and carelessly. I would have started a new game. This one is lost for you. The little Winfried, weakened by illness, slyly laughed at Giovinetta from the pillow whenever she lost to her brother in a game. Envy of the invincible Johann pricked him like a pin in the finger. Giovinetta acted, looking for an excuse, but Johann solemnly bent over the board. Checkmate. She began to argue something about the reckless move, but he, still laughing, only threw. But you lost anyway. Johann shone with life and character. It was not for nothing that he was called the son of Waldemar. Winfried, bedridden, bitterly envied his brother's ability to soften Inetta's heart with a single word. The other children also sought at least a crumb of his attention, but his entire gaze seemed to belong to Inetta. Winfried thought bitterly, why is Inetta the center of his world? While his brother and sister joked over the board, he felt like an unnecessary shadow. Eventually, in desperation, Winfried approached Johann in the main hall to finally voice his decision. Winfried spoke firmly, almost solemnly, I want to become a monk. I cannot be a knight, and I will be of more use with prayer than with the sword. The unexpected news surprised Johann, but Winfried stood as if rooted to the spot, convinced of his own position. No one would notice his absence next to his brother, who would always remain a leader. Winfried said with a mocking smile, a hedonist seeks pleasure precisely where it is absolutely forbidden. Johann asked sharply, have you decided to seduce women? Winfried brushed it off with a joke, and Johann only frowned. I don't want to hear about it. A shadow of interest fell on Winfred's face, who had really possessed his brother. Examining the blade, he suggested this dagger was not given by a noblewoman, was it? And added with impatient curiosity, I would like to see her. He noticed how the reflection of the old kiss always appeared in Johann's eyes. He played with teasing thoughts, wondering how he would react to the loss of the blade if he had secretly appropriated it. So he sat in the library, allowing these fantasies to quietly swarm. When someone's scream echoed through the corridors, Winfred noted dryly to himself the torture continues, and, breathing in the silence, remained among the books, as if protected by their dust and skin. He came to the library for an echo of the forbidden, to learn about the sarcophagus of the demon of the two-mind stone family, in which, perhaps, the power to fulfill human wishes was dormant. While humming in a low voice, Winfried suddenly looked up and saw Giovinetta, his lips twisted into a prickly smile. Winfried said sarcastically, "Only you were missing." Giovinetta frowned. "What are you doing here?" Winfred coldly snapped, "None of your business." She flared up, unable to contain her indignation. "You have no right to talk to your sister like that, Pat," and he only turned away contemptuously, as if her voice were an empty echo. To himself, Winfred branded her as selfish, but he was in no hurry to say it aloud. Returning to the stone chests, however, he again slipped a mocking smile at her. "Your second no spoiled the opportunity for peace, didn't it?" The phrase survived exactly. Yidis disappeared, wondering if her refusal to marry had really destroyed the chance of reconciliation. She wavered in her convictions, but her decision did not change. Winfred watched her silence with cold curiosity, hoping that she would leave when he began to work on the sarcophagus. Having once snatched the dagger from Johann out of simple curiosity, Winfred now used it as a lever to lift the stone and expose the secrets of the Toon family to the world. Seeing the blade, Giovinetta stood up to her full height. "Where did you get it?" Winfred replied with a disdainful, "No, don't worry about what doesn't belong to you." Giovinetta saply, "It's my dagger." She raised the blade so that the engraving fell into the light. "Tell me, what do you see?" Johann sat aside, distressed, and Winfried giggled nervously, as if to drive away the thought of injury, and Etta struck him sharply on the wrists. The blade fell with a clang to the floor, and Winfried, pale with insult, broke out with a cry, "How dare you hit me!" Etta raised the dagger, and holding the blade so that the wicks of light fell on the carving, asked in an even tone, "What do you see here?" Winfried? He flinched as if from a spark, but without taking her eyes off her, she explained to him the origin of the blade, running her finger over the markings. "This dagger belonged to our mother. Look at the engraving, here is her mark." Winfred was visibly irritated by Annetta's every movement, as if each stroke might cut through the air and touch skin, but as soon as she whispered that she considered the blade lost, his shoulders relaxed, and the smug shadow settled on his face again. He shrugged his shoulders in his mind, deciding that Annetta, as usual, was out of her place. He said out loud in an indifferent tone, as if doing a favor, "I won't hold on to him if he's so dear to you." Annetta immediately recognized the familiar pattern. He takes her things minus, and she remains the one to blame. Since childhood, Devoured been picking up the mess that Winfred had left behind. Grisella had excused him, and Annetta had demanded patience. This time her patience had run out, and she had asked sharply what he was doing around the sarcophagus. Winfred sighed, and pointed at the stone with his bare hands. "Because of you I have to tinker without tools." Annetta raised an eyebrow in surprise, not understanding why he was even climbing into the sarcophagus, if the lids were already open. Winfried shrugged, and adopted a mentoring tone. "They're not symbols, there's something inside." When he reached the inside, there was only dust. Annetta watched silently, as he dismantled the last cough and meese, the same one she had smashed open with a hammer. He glared sharply and asked without mincing words, "Did you smash the lids?" Annetta froze, searching for words in uncertain, and a nihil escaped her lips, and it only added fuel to the fire. Winfred began to stab her more painfully, humiliating her with pressure. Every word cut, but this pain was familiar to her from childhood. He showered her with reproaches about the disgrace to the family name, and even whispered that she was not worthy to be called Johann's sister. Doubt squeezed her heart so that she could not breathe. She noticed from the corner of her eye that several of her things were missing. Mine, and the thought flashed that the demon had returned to its stone shell. But when Winfred appeared, she somehow felt a pinch of relief. At least someone's presence kept fear at bay. Winfred, without stopping, wedged open the sarcophagus one by one, as if they contained the answer to the family curse. He pondered over the last one for a long time, while Annetta waited, catching the slightest movement on his face. The memory of that night squeezed her temples like an icy circle. Suddenly Winfred laughed briefly, and called her to the stone mouth. She looked inside. There was a large black wing, and she whispered, barely moving her lips, "That was his wing, Kretschmann." Winfred snorted and squinted. "And it's smaller than I imagined." Giovinetta gripped the hilt of her dagger tighter, remembering those demons she hadn't found in any tome, and the one that had emerged yesterday. The thought of the creature's true size pierced through her. If one wing was like that, what was the whole thing? Winfried tapped his fingers on the stone and asked without prelude, "Did you know that our family did not win the artifact in battle, but received it as a gift?" Giovinetta glanced sideways and clarified in a hoarse whisper, "What do you mean by gift?" He shrugged and explained, "The version we were given the demon's body as a holy talisman, that is what brought disaster upon us." Then another tone rang out in his voice, "A gift as a trap to impose a curse." He took canvases from the darkness of the cupboard and showed fragments of the monster that the Lord had supposedly carried away to the pile. Piece by piece other records claimed that some scholar had created a demon from his dead son. Winfried slowly shook his head, as if in resignation. At least one of the legends must touch on the truth. Giovinetta frowned skeptically, but her thoughts were flying like birds. She stopped them and said to herself, "If even a grain of this is true, then was not the creature with whom I spent the night born of death?" Giovinetta gathered herself and asked a question, as if searching for some meaning in the evil spell. Why were the two milestones doomed to such a disaster? Winfried did not answer, but threw a fragment of the lid on the floor. The dust rose in a cloud. Then he weighed the losses of the family and counted them. As if in prayer, only 3 remained: she and Johann. He added with cold logic, "Only he can continue the line. You are moving towards marriage, and I have chosen monasticism." But suddenly something in his gaze shifted. A predatory spark flashed, suspicious, disturbingly familiar. Annette felt a chill run down her spine. Winfried slowly bowed his head, as if sneaking up on his own conclusion, and looked straight at her. "But Johann is without a fiancé, without a wife, without children, not a single bastard. Do you understand, Annette? This is the end of the House of Two Stones." He clapped his hands together slowly, with a mocking echo, and, smiling faintly, added, as if putting a full stop to the letter, "Whoever presented this monster to our family as a gift wanted one thing, minus to wipe out the two stones. And, considering the scale of this creature, his hatred was boundless." Giovinetta shuddered, and, clasping her fingers, barely audibly asked him to end this conversation. The topic disgusted her. She did not want to rummage in the dark anymore. However, Winfried did not calm down, as if fueled by his own conclusions, and pressed on step by step. "It seems that we have been destined for complete destruction, so that the torment will be long and merciless. Don't you agree, Annette?" A lump stuck in her throat. Her eyes filled with salty fire. Through her tears she began to beg him to be quiet, but the drops rolled, did not stop, until her bowed knees betrayed her support. Having settled down on the stone floor in front of her brother, she no longer had the strength to squeeze out a word, or gather a request together. All that remained was a trembling silence and heavy breathing, broken between sobs. Winfried looked at Giovinetta, covering his mouth with his hand as if he were sick, and with a crooked smile he said, "God, how pitiful you are." Turning towards the exit, and already walking towards the stairs, he carelessly threw over his shoulder, "Wait here. I'll call Grisella." Giovinetta remained silent, sprawled on the stone floor, trying to recover from a fit of crying, and convulsively wiping her face with her hands. Through sobs and burning shame, she still managed to breathe out the words that trembled like a string. "It's all because you don't understand anything, Winfried." At that moment, she was again stung by the feeling of the demon's touch, the same one that had haunted her at night. Perhaps it was the play of an overtighter imagination among the gloomy sarcophagus, for she could not get up from pain and exhaustion. As he climbed the stairs, Winfried walked slowly, completely absorbed in the thought of the dagger that Annette had returned to Johann. A cold conclusion was brewing in his head, and he said quietly to himself, "A thorny rose is carved on the blade. Didn't she give it to Johanna as a sign of her feelings? No, if she had, she wouldn't have so recklessly admitted that it was her thing." Pulling up his hood and holding his skirts so as not to trip, the boy jumped outside, swallowing the sharp air. Suddenly, another guess flashed through his memory, and he grimaced with jealousy. Or maybe Johann simply stole the blade to have something with him that would remind him of Giovinetta. A scream cut through the air, a piercing, eerie scream, filled with such pain that the veins in my temples vibrated with terror. This sound made Winfried's whole body shudder. No matter how he hid his fear, Gussenst betrayed it. He had never heard such a terrifying scream. Noticing the guard, Winfried stopped, frowned, and asked sharply, "Are you still mocking yesterday's prisoner? It would be more humane to end his torment when such screams are unbearable to listen to." The guard paused, took a half-step forward, and calmly said, "No, that's not the prisoner screaming. It's the young lord himself attacking." The world shifted for a moment from what he heard. Winfried swayed so sharply that he almost flew over the balcony railing. The news hit his head with a dark wave. The frantic scream did not subside, splitting his skull, but the most terrifying thing was the realization his brother was screaming in that voice, and he could no longer turn away, pretend that it did not concern him. He laughed bitterly, as if he had been struck by frostbite. "Seriously? You call these soul-rending screams simply an attack?" The guard stood silently, offering no explanation. There was no point in excuses. Memories rolled in like an avalanche. Johann, the missing dagger, Giovinetta, suffering half-conscious among the stone chest, all of this came crashing down together, preventing my thoughts from becoming sober. He remembered how Johann, exhausted after the front, had quietly watched him on an ordinary day, an image that had been etched in his memory, and would not leave him for a long time. His face presented itself to my inner gaze quietly sad, despite Waldemar's fame and nickname of the Sun, and this contrast made my chest clench so sharply that I had to lean against the cold stone of the wall. The young lord, of course, could not openly admit that he had secretly appropriated his sister's blade. Such an act would not only be disapproved of, but also a disgrace to his name. Moreover, he would never admit that he kept that dagger in the chest of drawers as a secret sign of his own longing, a symbol known only to himself. Winfried suggested that the loss of such a precious thing might have thrown his brother off balance, causing his attacks to intensify and him to become uncontrollable, like a ship tossed by a storm. Winfried's hands trembled and were sticky with sweat. His face had turned pale, and raising his hands to his forehead, he looked as if his strength were leaving him on his last breath. Winfried thought, "You are trying to suppress the forbidden urge that is pulling you to the limit. I guessed it from the very beginning. Johann, you are no better than me." Meanwhile, night fell on the estate, and the screams still did not subside. The inhabitants, gritting their teeth, learned to live next to this nightmare that shattered the silence of the stone walls. A strange calm reigned in Giovinetta's chambers. Only the muffled echo of screams could be heard, and the open window stirred the light curtains that fell in waves to the headboard. Inetta was sleeping deeply, and evenly. Giovinetta closed her eyes as soon as Grisella led her into the bedroom, exhausted to the point of exhaustion. After everything she had experienced, she had completely lost both her appetite and her sleep. Nausea was taking away her strength, and this time even a sincere desire to wake up did not help her emerge from the darkness. Despite the prolonged cries that had been echoing throughout the castle since yesterday, her sleep was so heavy that no sound could break through it. Fatigue had literally closed the lid over her. Eventually, consciousness began to awaken through the slumber. A sharp, scraping sound came. King seemed to be scratching the stone under the window of her room. The demon slowly slipped inside, fixed his gaze on the sleeping Giovinetta, and then moved deeper into the room, stepping as silently as a shadow. Even in her sleep, Inetta shuddered, her heart fluttered, anxiety surged in waves, and tears rolled from beneath her closed eyelids, as if water had broken through a thin dam. But she couldn't move. Exhaustion had sapped her strength, and even though the noise around her was growing louder, her body wouldn't obey. The creature's powerful, rope-like tail wrapped around her waist and lifted her up, taking her breath away with its grip and leaving no room for resistance. She was suddenly brought to her knees on the floor before the creature. Although Inetta was not sure if it was truly a demon, its firm touch made it immediately clear that the will at this moment did not belong to her. While he controlled her movements, holding and moving her as he needed, Giovinetta begged that her eyelids would not open, and that dawn would break through the night sooner, that he would not return every night to do with her as he pleased. She felt like a helpless puppet in someone else's game. The voice in her head spoke with a familiar, painful tone. "Open your eyes, Giovinetta." The words echoed over and over again, and she obeyed without hesitation, accepting the order as if it were her own thought. He took her by the chin and forced her face up. The voice came back into consciousness, sharp and cold. The voice whispered, "You must look at me." Tears were streaming down her cheeks, but she could no longer resist. It seemed that every cell in her had submitted to the power of this being. The demon's gaze burned with a clear request as he stared at the girl, as if he dreamed of only one thing, that she would answer him with her eyes. It seemed that even if it were his last earthly desire, he would still not refuse what he had already expressed. When Giovinetta finally looked up, her eyes were filled with fear, blurred by tears that trembled in the dim light. The demon saw everything, but instead of stopping, he burned even more fiercely, like a fire fueled by the wind. His features lit up with delight the moment their eyes met. His fingers trembled involuntarily, his palms sweated, and his narrowed gaze betrayed an awkward uncertainty. Who would have believed that a creature of that kind could be embarrassed by the gaze of an ordinary girl? Long-clawed fingers gently slid down her cheeks, and despite the tears that slowly fell and darkened on the edge of her nightgown, she felt every touch down to the smallest line. The demon spoke softly, almost not in a voice, but in a breath. "Why are you so silent today?" The girl was petrified, and silence words were not found. The dream that had just enveloped her in a warm fog dissipated, leaving only a tangle of thoughts about him. Could this really be Johann? Could he have changed so much? She wanted to believe with pain that this was all a sinister ghost from which she was about to wake up in her own bed. Her brother appeared before her inner vision, and her whole body tightened, as if from the cold. She forcibly pushed away this intrusive delusion, not wanting to hear his timbre or feel his close breath on her skin. The very thought of it frightened her so much that her hands trembled, and a scream rolled up to her throat and stuck there in an unbroken knot. She did not give up and resisted as much as her spirit could bear, but her strength was slipping away, as was her hope for the end of this night, when the monster would retreat. However, somewhere deep in her heart, a glimmer of faith smoldered behind the demon's mask. Her brother, whom she was desperately trying to reach, could still be lurking. The skin tensed from the pressure of the paws, which were inevitably approaching. The demon leaned towards her face, trying to bring his lips closer, but Giovinetta, gathering the last of her strength, restrained his movement, trying to push the creature's head away, at least to a distance of breath. She was irritated to the bone by the self-confident manner in which the creature touched her face. She had no doubt that she was facing a real beast, deprived of due respect, but at the same time, she was tormented by the question, was there even a shred of the Johann she had once loved sincerely and unconditionally? The monster's smile, with its jagged, predatory teeth showing, only intensified her despair. Panic came in waves, alternating with a sense of disgust, but she mustered her will and kept her balance. Otherwise she risked losing herself completely. Giovinetta felt like a helpless puppet in the clutches of a terrible creature that was turning her around like a toy without asking permission. She would give anything to erase this darkness from her memory, both what she had seen and what she had felt like a terrifying dream that hurt even after waking. Grabbing her wrists and pressing them above her head, the demon froze with a smile and whispered, so that each syllable cut through the air, "Am I really that disgusting to Our Lady? You said it with that look that sparkled with disgust. Don't you remember?" This phrase hit Giovinetta like ice water. Memories swirled in her head, brief encounters, fragmentary conversations, fleeting glances. She couldn't recall any insult, couldn't find any deliberate humiliation there. She wasn't capable of intentionally hurting him. Could she really hit him so hard and not notice it? The demon leaned closer, fascinated by the light of her blue eyes, which drove him mad. But as soon as he heard her quiet denial, something stirred in him. She remembered nothing. Maybe he really had woven this picture out of his own anxiety? His posture straightened, anger flared in his pupils, and the words cut through the darkness. "No, I haven't forgotten. I remember every moment, every look you gave me, every word you said, and with that angelic face, with that calling voice, with those lips, you pushed me away." Giovinetta had resisted before, but after these words her hands fell away. She lost the ground beneath her, as if she had fallen through the sheets into a dark corner of the world. Excuses fell apart, and thoughts, like black birds, invaded her consciousness. She rushed deep into her memory, searching for the moment when she could have pushed him away and hurt him, or even a hint of it. How? She couldn't find anything like it. Could she have dared to do something like that? It seemed like never. But suddenly, it appeared, the hall in which he had staggered and fainted. She then rushed to help, tried to lift him up, to support him with her shoulder. But he was too strong, too heavy, and her strength was gone. In despair, she abandoned her futile attempts, afraid of doing even more harm. His voice, like a blade, cut through the numbness and threw her back into reality. If she could, she would have dissolved into thin air, so as not to hear this low whisper, in which something animalistic groaned. It seemed better to fade away than to stay near him any longer and endure this unbearable closeness. He leaned in very close, and his words pierced her to the bone. "Tell me, am I really worse than that old man you were going to marry? Be glad that didn't happen, but you still look at me with disgust. Do you really want me to just disappear?" The forces were inexorably leaving her body. The girl could barely keep her eyelids open to look at the demon's face, but a sudden sharp pain in her wrist forced her eyes wide open and brought her back to reality. Inette involuntarily opened her mouth, greedily swallowing air, just to keep herself from screaming, which could have gone so loud that the entire guard would have come running, and then this night would have become even more terrifying. Gathering the last shreds of strength, she spoke softly, but firmly, determination in every word. "Please let me go. Stop this. I was wrong. I just want you to disappear, Johannes. Johannes!" She closed her eyes tightly, as if afraid to see the next moment, as if her desperate frankness might bring on an even darker calamity that she could no longer bear. But instead of groans and heavy sighs, instead of new pain, a strange lightness enveloped her. Like a swift breath of freedom, she felt that the bonds had fallen off, and yet fear did not allow her to open her eyes immediately. She only dared to open them when she heard a painfully familiar voice. The one she had grown up with. It was Johann, and the boy, confused, whispered faintly, "Inette," looking at his sister as if he himself could not believe what was happening, and this confusion did not go unnoticed. She stared at him, and for the first time in an endless time, peace settled in her chest, the same childlike and warm peace she had felt when they had run around the yard together, forgetting about the rest of the world and their little worries. The memory touched the corners of her mouth with a faint smile, but the memory melted away like morning mist, and all she could hear was her brother's soft, inaudible plea. The words slipped by, and she no longer understood a single one. Inette took her last clear breath. Her lips said nothing more, and silence and darkness gently descended before her eyes, taking away both voices and thoughts, leaving behind a strange peace that resembled liberation. The next moment, her heart beat so hard in her chest that she shuddered and woke up. Her body ached as if after a hard battle. A light vapor stood around her, and, gathering her will, she slowly, heavily opened her eyes. She was sitting in the bathtub, and Johann was next to her. His features showed anxiety mixed with relief, because the main thing had already happened. She was alive, and that took at least a breath of terror out of him. Her body was exhausted to the point of exhaustion. She looked exhausted, as if she had walked through flames, and rest was not just desired, but vital to every cell. Johann understood the reason was in he had driven his sister to the brink, and no excuses or words of repentance could dissolve the guilt that gripped his heart with a cold ring. Convinced that she was capable of coping without outside help, he did not dare even to touch her, bowing his head. He barely held back tears, realizing how far he had led them both into the night's terror. His hand rested on the edge of the bathtub. He was about to get up and leave, because he understood that it was wrong to stay here. He had no right to help her. They weren't even allowed to see each other. But suddenly, Annette's trembling fingers gently covered his hand. She found the strength in her voice to whisper, and asked in a way that could not be confused with anything, "Stay. Don't go." The boy did not dare to look up. He was afraid to see again the exhausted, pale face that reflected the entire night's catastrophe and held onto the guilt even more tightly. She whispered with relief, in which there was exhaustion and trust, and this whisper was almost childish. "John, is that you?" This phrase hit him sharper than a blade. Wet marks appeared on his face. There seemed to be no tears, but his expression left no doubt what he had heard had touched his most vulnerable spot. There was something unearthly in her gaze, such a bright lightness and purity that the blue pupils glowed with the same childlike warmth with which she had once looked at him, and this only deepened his shame and silent pity. With her hands pounding unbearably, Giovinetta slowly pulled them out of the water and timidly extended them toward the boy, as if seeking support in his presence, even though every movement was painful. Johann froze for a moment, staring at her open hands. Not understanding her intention, this simple gesture seemed a mystery to him, and he did not understand what exactly she was asking. His intense gaze and furrowed eyebrows made the girl feel confused for a moment. It occurred to her that she had chosen a bad moment and had not taken into account his condition, having done something inappropriate. A heavy pause hung between them. Like thick air, tears flashed on her eyelashes, not from resentment, but from overflowing happiness, because in her blue eyes shone the main truth. Her brother, the real, living Johann, had returned to her, holding her outstretched arms. "Giovinetta whispered faintly, "Hug me, Johann." And he heard. Although his surprise stirred him, he could not and did not want to refuse. Her thoughts carried her far from the present, how long she had lived in isolation, as if imprisoned, deprived of a living word, with only cold guards who avoided her gaze and spoke soullessly. For years she had seen Johann only as an important family figure, distant, silent, unapproachable. He was like a wall behind which nothing existed, and their childhood conversations had died out before they had even been born. But here, in the still silence of the bath, she again felt his closeness, and familiar smell. Before her was the same brother, sincere, warm, defenseless, like behind her Johann, and from this a quiet happiness blossomed in her chest, which she hardly dared to show. She caught his every move, how he threw on the towel, how he pulled her close to him, hugging her tightly, as if he never wanted to let go. He was joyful in this closeness, although a thin thread of tension still lingered between them. The remnants of anger, anxiety, and bitterness melted away inside these hugs, which she had been waiting for so long. Finally brought back a sense of the weight of her own life. For the first time in many years, she felt needed. Closing her eyes, she dissolved into the warmth of the water, allowing herself to forget the harrowing details of the night. Lightness and peace enveloped her like a distant mist, and she allowed this soft wave to carry her. She felt herself sinking slowly to the very bottom, looking up at the light filtering through the surface. In that moment, everything superfluous disappeared, and her only desire was simple: to go silently, peacefully, as if in a good dream. But with an effort of will, she brought herself back to the present. She turned to Johann and noticed how he was slowly backing away, as if he was afraid of this closeness, and didn't know if he had the right to it. His confusion did not hide from her gaze, seeing her face so close. Johann was confused, and the expression of his features changed suddenly, as if something in him had shifted. Annette quietly asked, "Are you uncomfortable? Are you in pain?" And a quiet sadness appeared in her eyes, as if she was looking for someone nearby who would simply hold her hand, stay, appreciate and love her unconditionally. And then, without a shadow of hesitation, she said clearly and firmly, as if it had been a long-considered decision, "I like you, Johann. Do you understand? I like you? His heart sank. These words rang out like thunder, for they were spoken by the same sister with whom they had seen so rarely since childhood, as if years of silence had passed between them. But her confused look explained everything. She was simultaneously happy and aching from loneliness. It felt like this moment was perhaps the only opportunity to voice the truth, and it was better to tell it now than to regret the wasted chance later. She reached out to him and whispered faintly, I like you, so please, protect, as if she were asking not so much for an action as for a saving presence. She hugged him tighter, leaned closer, closed her eyes and froze, waiting for the gentle, careful gesture of closeness that would be the seal of their reconciliation and quiet trust. Johann gripped the edge of the bathtub tighter, either out of confusion, or because he didn't know how to handle this unusual proximity that was throwing him off balance. Tears welled up on their own, and he couldn't help but cry right in front of her. His voice broke into a whisper as he said, I'm sorry, because he didn't want to cause her even more pain and put pressure on her where it was already hell. They both gave in to their feelings in the warmth of the water and the flickering of the candles. Everything around seemed to disappear. Only they remained. Only the trembling closeness in which long lived it seemed that this was the moment they had been waiting for their whole lives. It was night outside, and a soft glow was emanating from the window of Annette's room, the lone light in the darkness that involuntarily attracted the gazes of random passers-by. Giovinetta fell asleep in her own bed, warm in her chest, happy that she had dared to tell the truth, that Johann was there, that her loneliness had receded. But suddenly, her eyelids barely opened. Something broke the silence, and what she saw surprised her more than she had expected. Johann sat on the floor. His head was twitching from nervous tension. Sleep was not coming to him, as if he was afraid to touch. He had never dared to lie down next to her. Even after everything that had happened between them in the bath, the rules remained unshakable, and he still obeyed them without exception. Annette called him by name, and gently asked, How long are you going to sit on the cold floor instead of going to bed? The boy looked up warily and replied evenly, I'll leave before dawn when the guard changes. Don't worry. I'm sorry to make you worry. I didn't mean to. Alarmed, she insisted that if he stayed like this until morning, his back would hurt, but Johann only remained silent, not wanting to argue or add unnecessary words. Instead, he carefully tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear. His presence there seemed almost unreal, being so close, touching, kissing as if they had momentarily crossed over into another world. Her body still ached from what she had experienced, but the slight dizziness was caused not by the night, but by the very image of her brother, whom she had last seen so closely in her childhood. His gaze drove her crazy. She understood that they were not truly destined to be together, and that what burned between them was like a short-lived miracle, but every feature of his raised a storm of feelings in her. Annette asked softly, How are you feeling, Johann? Won't happen again. Stretching her hands out to him, and he could no longer take his eyes off her movements. Her light palms touched his face. The tension gradually melted away, giving way to a calmness that slowly filled his gaze. Johann closed his eyes, inhaling the familiar scent. The moment was casual, but piercingly deep, that held so much unspoken that they had carried within them for years. He held her hands in his fingers sliding over the thin skin. Annette smiled faintly, and that smile said more than any confession. The air was filled with a tension capable of waking up the whole world. Bowing his head, he whispered, I thought it was just a terrible dream. If you hadn't called me then, I might never have stopped. And his gaze, overcome with shame, faded somewhere below, between his knees. But she stopped him, not letting him continue, and said clearly, I felt relieved. Last time I also called you many times, but only now you heard me. Annette's words wouldn't let go, swirling in his head with new force. But it was the phrase last time that suddenly brought up a long picture in Johann's memory, as if someone's touch had unsealed a forgotten memory. Her reproaches rang in his ears again. Like the blows of a bell, he heard her scream then, and the memory entered his heart with a sting. She had cried out, You are so blinded by being called the son of Valve. Why, that you have completely forgotten about the punishment of heaven. You pretend not to hear me when I screamed at you. Stop. Annette's voice came in wave after wave. She called to him, and he stood, silent and speechless, trying to understand whether he himself had not turned into the person he had always hated and did not want to recognize in himself. That conversation left a furrow like a scar on a stone, plunging deeper into the memories. Johann dreamed of turning back time, and spoken desires, unspoken phrases, gestures he dared not make. All of this seemed to be able to change the course of events. Looking at her brother's exhausted face, Giovinetta suddenly wondered what if he held that memory not as a fact, but as his own night terror, in which he was lost between guilt and shame? And then a clear understanding struck. He ran, epiphany so sharp and sudden that she could barely hold her breath, and not not give herself away with an exclamation. Perhaps the essence of the demon is not cruelty or ruthlessness, but rather the turning of the darkest recesses of the soul outward. The demon is not a being but a form, a mirror reflecting the shadows of Johann's consciousness. His hoarse whisper from that ghastly form came back to her mind, and a crack in her memory from the repeated accusation. She remembered how he had said every time, with that innocent look and those seductive lips, "You refused me. Am I that disgusting to you?" Why did he say that? What made him feel neglected? She had never allowed herself to say words that could humiliate him, and she would never even think about it. The thought seemed impossible to her. Unable to bear this burden in silence any longer, she decided to ask the question directly, because only he couldn't tie the knot that had been squeezing her heart for several nights. She asked quietly, barely touching his name, "Johann, do you hate me?" And he, shocked, turned around sharply. Her wide-eyed open eyes fixed him. The words stuck in his throat, and only a surprised hate escaped. Annette lowered her gaze, and a shadow entered her tone. "Then that explains everything. Those phrases you said. I don't understand why you hated me. Did I do something that made you feel unwanted or repulsive?" Johann was petrified, his expression speaking louder than any explanation. He did not understand how she had arrived at such conclusions, and at the same time he was stunned by the wave of her sudden guesses. He turned away, unable to bear the directness of her gaze. He knew the real reason, but even if he tried to explain it, he was afraid that an explanation would only hurt and not bring understanding. His silence irritated her, and the thought that the problem might be in her made her itch like a needle. Rest would have been a salvation, but Annette knew she wouldn't close her eyes until she got to the bottom of it. She grabbed a pillow and threw it straight at her brother, aiming for his head, somehow shake him out of his half-leap to break the strange numbness in which he was frozen. Johann deftly intercepted the soft projectile and looked out from under it with a confused look on his face, but Annette was already pouring in demands. "What was that? You hated me, and now you're saying it's not my fault? Are you even going to explain everything properly?" She clutched at the second pillow and went on the offensive with a new outburst of irritation, demanding clarity. But he dodged the blows and, instead of a direct answer, spoke carefully in hints, avoiding sharp corners. Finally, he covered himself with a pillow, which hid his face, like a shield behind which to hide from her words and actions, a kind of brief respite in a hopeless conversation. He exhaled and, as if drawing a line, said, "Even if I started explaining, you still wouldn't understand." To which Annette snapped, her voice burning with pain and anger. "So I have to remain in the dark. I have no right to know why you treated me like that." Johann realized that in a moment the raised voices would attract the guard, so without hesitation, he snatched the pillow from Annette's hands and threw it aside, quelling the argument before it escalated into an alarm for the entire house. With a decisive movement, he lifted her into his arms and carried her to the bed, trying to persuade her with silence, because it seemed she had forgotten in these walls. Every unnecessary word could turn into a fatal echo. Putting her down with unexpected care, he leaned over and touched her lips with his finger, as if placing an invisible seal. Silence now weighed more than any explanations. Giovinetta had not expected such gentleness. She was surprised by the lightness of his touch, but she left it without comment, allowing a brief tremor to betray her confusion. Stepping back a little, he whispered, evenly, to convince rather than scare, "Quiet. If you break down again, the guards will burst in Han, and then the horror will begin in reality." He was still hovering over her, his gaze gliding over her pupils, which were now shining not with resentment, but with astonished delight. It stopped him like a sudden breath of coolness. Annette slightly raised her finger, as if calling attention, and suddenly said naively, almost shyly, "Johann, can you throw me on the bed again? Just like that." Not having time to understand exactly how this might sound to his ears, Han's eyes wide, and involuntarily, he couldn't believe that in this tense moment, she was so carefree, no longer a child, still clinging to the little jokes and habits of the past. He sighed deeply and bowed his head, accepting the absurdity of the situation as unnecessary release for the tension that had built up between them over these long hours. With his forehead resting on her chest, he listened to the silence. Giovinetta felt her heart quicken its pace, and hoped that this rhythm would reach him as distinctly as it had reached her. She touched his hand lightly, returning his attention. The subtle gesture was enough for him to look up and give her that same small smile, a modest one, but more eloquent than long speeches. She held his head close to her, like a child, and whispered warmly, "You know, when I was scared, I always dreamed of seeing you. Even if you became different, I still waited to meet you." At that moment, Giovinetta realized she loved him, even when he appeared to her in the form of a demon. Yes, she was offended and angry, but even in the darkest moments, her feelings did not fade away. No one could replace Johann. He slowly took her hand and, without haste, raised it to his face. Annette maintained an outward calm, but her heart responded with a timid wave that betrayed her shyness. When he touched her hand with his lips, he did so with the grace of a man who respects and cherishes. It was enough for the world around him to melt away, and for her to allow herself to dissolve in his arms. Even if fate would not allow them to be together, there was something undeniably real about this moment. Prohibitions and limits, judgments and rules had moved beyond the edge of their vision. The world seemed to be silent. They did not listen to external sounds, or look around. They only felt it was the second kiss that Giovinetta forever, and she did not want the morning. She did not want extraneous steps in the room. She only wanted this closeness. As children, they had laughed the same way, thrown pillows, and played around without a shadow of anxiety. Warm pictures of the past had warmed her on gloomy days, and now they had come to life in the arms of the dearest person. She dreamed that time would stop, but reality stubbornly reminded her of its own. They were not destined to be together, and even if she tried to change something, it would most likely end in her being banished from the kingdom. The only thing she couldn't say out loud was to be close to her brother the way her soul longed for, not in short dreams or secretly, but openly. And yet she didn't allow herself even the thought of excessive closeness, much less an accidental, overly attentive glance at herself during daytime training. The whisper of rain trickling down the windows calmed Giovinnetta's agitated heart. She consciously let go of her anxious thoughts, cut off the fear that Johann might be exposed at any moment, and decided to simply live in the present moment without looking back. But the peace was shattered. She was startled by the voice that since childhood had known how to wake her from the deepest sleep. It was Grisella, and she stood confused and wary, staring at the girl, and finally spoke. Pale as a ghost, Grisella came closer and whispered, "Madame, you?" Agi sat up in bed and asked quietly, "Grisella, how long have you been standing here?" And her weak, agitated tone only increased the nurse's anxiety, although she quickly regained control of herself. Having dismissed the question, the nanny transferred the conversation and looked warily wide-eyed. "You decide to take a bath yesterday?" Because once an unauthorized bath could mean a desire to wash away an unscrupulous intention. Giovinetta remembered how she had come out of the font. The floor was standing in water, the fire in the stove had almost gone out, and the ashes had hardened into a black crust on the remains of her dress. Traces of burnt clothing confirmed her nocturnal presence, but no sign of Johann remained, not a breath, not a shadow. Grisella's gaze became more attentive. Gently, but persistently she asked, "Madame, don't you want to tell me something about what happened last night?" Giovinnetta's heart froze. She did not like lies, but the naked truth could turn into a sentence, and silence suddenly became like a step over a precipice. But the nurse's words were too apt. Perhaps she had seen something, or at least suspected it, and that made everything seem even more dangerous. Searching for at least some plausible excuse, Giovinetta hesitantly whispered, "I just sweated a lot," and decided, but she didn't have time to finish. Sharp pain ripped through her head, as if something inside had broken. She bent over, convulsively clutching her stomach with her hands. Weakness had set in so that it seemed that in a moment she would lose consciousness. When the attack subsided, Grisella was already holding her like a child, touching her forehead. She felt a burning heat, heavy and disturbing. Grisella spoke gently, even with a hint of guilt. "Have you been so hot since the evening?" "Madam, you should have called me. Did you try to start the fire yourself? And did you burn your dress? What if you got hurt? You don't know how to do that at all." Today, the nanny was especially careful. She always looked after Annetta as if she were her own, and although such care had long been tiring, now it seemed almost a comfort. But her words kept ringing in my ears for a long time. "You don't even know how to light a fire." And Annette wondered what she really knew. If as a child she believed that weapons grew from the ground and food appeared on trees by itself. She lay down again. Her strength was leaving her body, but her ears were attentive to the nurse's order not to get up and wait for porridge, because even medicine would be a heavy burden now. Already on the threshold, Grisella added with concern, "Sleep is the best medicine." "Rest, madame." When the room was empty, Annette looked around her and remembered he wasn't here. She had fallen asleep, feeling his warmth next to her, and now he had disappeared without a trace. Disregarding the prohibition to stay in bed, Giovinetta, neither the throbbing pain in her temples or the nauseating weakness could hold her back. She absolutely had to find out where Johann was. She moved to another room, always private to her, with shelves, chests, and the faint scent of memories that lingered in the air like the old perfume of home. It was her cozy hiding place of comfort. There were children's trinkets, an old piano, and a chair with a red cover that harmonized wonderfully with the color of several favorite chests. With quiet steps, she glided among the wooden giants that guarded stories, and searched for just one, familiar to every scratch, to the smallest chip on the edge. Finally, her gaze recognized the one she needed, light brown, with gilded piping. Her heart sank with joy, and she rushed towards it, ignoring the creaking floor. Inside, between the soft layers of clothing, lay Johann. He slept right on top of her things, wrapped in the warmth and comfort of her childhood, like a blanket of memories. Grisella's voice woke him up even earlier, so when the sun slipped through the window and touched his face, he was already ready and smiled, saying calmly, I'm not afraid of cramped quarters. I once spent the night in a bear's den. Compared to that, this chest is a palace warm, soft as a better than a bed. This story captivated the girl. She longed to hear. More might flashed in her eyes, and a quiet smile appeared on her lips. Johann laughed, ran his hand through his hair and added, as if measuring the words with memories. Every time I remember, ants run down my back. It was last winter. In the rear we retreated with difficulty. The right flank was broken. We were surrounded, and that den became the only chance to escape. Inette felt the tension tighten in her chest. She listened carefully, and wondered if those events had left traces on his body. She gently placed her fingers on his hand. Her skin was burning with heat, as if her hands had just been taken out of boiling water, and Johann looked up at her in surprise. Sudden words snapped him out of his thoughts as she whispered, "You were injured," and he intertwined their fingers, a reassuring touch, as if answering without further explanation that he was fine. He spoke with a slight smile, but a serious voice. Maybe there was once, but a long time ago. Everything has healed. And now, I am next to you, and I don't want to go back to those memories. Running his hand over her cheek, he realized that the heat wasn't just in her hands, her whole body was on fire, and anxiety suddenly clouded his gaze. He stood up abruptly, looking simply and seriously. Now you should think not about me, but about yourself. You are burning, Inette. Get up and go back to bed. But she didn't want to leave. She wanted to stay close for just a moment longer, to talk, to be with, to use every second that was given to them. She put her arms around his neck and whispered, almost inaudibly, let's stay a little longer, until Grisella comes back. Understanding her desire, he smiled and suggested a childishly simple solution, to hide together in a chest and lie there for a few minutes, like little children. Inette's eyes widened with joy, her heart pounded, as if before a leap into the abyss, exciting and frightening at the same time. But something stopped her. She suddenly recoiled and cast a wary glance at the chest, not because it was dirty or cramped. The very thought of climbing inside a second time caused an inner resistance. It contained only children's things, but still, something about this hiding place was repulsive. Anxious thoughts were racing around, and she tried to calm them with the only comforting truth there. In the darkness, Johann was waiting for her. Inette froze, looking at the chest. The thought that Johann had only ended up there because of her own request to hide from Griselle, that began to gnaw at her from within. If she had guessed that she would feel such embarrassment, her imagination conjured up an image, once placed in a similar stone chest, and her heart clenched with an inexplicable cold. Johann noticed how her gaze seemed glued to the lid. A subtle glimmer of fear or inner tension flickered in it, and he couldn't immediately figure out what had her so alarmed. Her plan vanished like a mist when Johann called her name twice, trying to bring her back from the foggy shore of thoughts into the warm reality of their closeness. Despite the tangle of anxiety stirring inside, she did not want to move away. Gathering her will, Inette stepped forward, as if she had crossed the invisible boundary of her own doubts. She slowly reached out her arms to him, and he accepted the gesture just as carefully, pulling her toward him into the hiding place, the chest, that for a moment became a home. They lay down side by side in a small space, as if in a treasury of shared childhood memories. Their embrace was warm and gentle, and every touch was etched in memory, like a promise made without witnesses. Smiling, Inette half-jokingly said that she wouldn't mind staying here with him forever, and this half-joke sounded like a quiet dream that one is ashamed of but doesn't let go of. It's just a pity that Johann wasn't free. His path was determined by the palace, every step under close surveillance, and even talking to his own sister was possible only on the sly, with the thought of escape and cautious glances into the shadows. They dreamed of being together, breathing the same air, feeling each other's warmth, and in the cozy darkness of the chests they almost dozed off, not wanting to return to the world of prohibitions and rules. Inette stood up, leaned over her brother, and, smiling playfully, looked into his eyes. He had only just begun a sentence, but she stopped him with a gentle movement. She leaned down and kissed him deeply, desperately, putting all the hidden tenderness and love that had long lived under the locks of silence, leaving the taste of a dream on her lips. The words that escaped his lips dissolved in the air with a soft rustle. Then there was only the touch, only the kiss, in which their ineffable experience trembled. She understood that she had no right to do this. She shouldn't have even appeared in this room, shouldn't have asked for that protective prayer, but she was ready to accept any punishment just so that Johann would stay alive. Finally, Johann carefully helped her up and back to bed, covering her. He ran his fingertips over her cheeks, as if putting the final, careful touch on a picture of peace. Giovinetta fell asleep almost immediately, the smile still lingering on her lips as sleep gently enveloped her body. Peace returned because he was there, and that was enough. The hours spent together seemed like magic. The cold of the floor, the warmth divided in half, forbidden kisses among children's things. It wasn't evil, rather the only refuge in the world that stubbornly separated them. Johann quickly threw a white sheet over himself and, sliding down the stairs, disappeared before the doorknob clicked with the first movement of the morning. He passed the maid's room so quickly and quietly that he left not even a rustle behind him, only an empty corridor with a shadow that instantly dissolved. Just then Grisella came out of the kitchen, carrying a tray of hot porridge, carrying potion of strength for Giovannitti's recovery, imbued with the scent of home. Even in her sleep, Annette felt his presence, a familiar scent, a warm touch. Her lips stretched into a happy smile, and she understood that these were the warmest moments of her short life, which she would cherish like a secret warmed by her palms. With each passing day, it became increasingly difficult for Giovinetta to hide her feelings, but the illness, like a strange gift in an untimely envelope, also had a bright side. Under its pretext, Johann appeared in her chambers more and more often, covering himself with careful concern for her well-being, and as if by chance, staying longer than etiquette allowed. While she dozed, an extraordinary meeting was taking place in the great hall of the palace. Knights, advisors, and the king himself, Johann's father, had gathered around a long table, and the air was thick with tension, as if before a thunderstorm. The king raised an eyebrow at one of his advisors in surprise, and said coldly, "Exorcism? Are you serious? Are you saying that my eldest son, the heir to the house of Waldemar, should undergo a rite of exorcism? Is that what I'm hearing now?" The initiator of the disturbing proposal turned out to be Winfried, the king's youngest son, Johann's brother, whose voice today sounded confident and insistent. The hall exploded with indignation, and one of the knights slammed his fist on the table. "Lord Winfried, of all those present, you are the most imperious. At such a critical moment, talking about demons, it's about the young lord, our son Waldemar. It was an ordinary attack, and you see dark signs in it." But Winfried only seemed to cover his ears from the noise. His stubbornness was rooted deeper than other people's anger. He longed not only for order, he was tormented by envy. After all, Johann had received everything: power, honor, expectations, and he was left with a thin, cold shadow. He broke into a fit of rage, and threw himself into the hall with a sharp word, and the knights who tried to stop him scattered, like autumn leaves. Where are they now? Some still haven't gotten up. They lie with their heads on their wives' knees. And he was not going to stop. There was a firm determination in his eyes. Winfried was ready to go to the edge just to get what he wanted. He sighed slowly, looked around the hall, then fixed his eyes on the king. "Father, let's put aside gossip, but you know how it works. Once rumors of possession take root, the enemies will rush to finish them off. Remember the House of Two Stones, their dark secrets, and the whispers about Giovannetta." Voices and breathing fell silent in the hall. Winfried dared to recall the demon family that had disappeared centuries ago, and most terrifyingly to associate that name with his sister. He continued in a flat, stern tone, "If we don't react now, these rumors will break people. We are one step away from winning the war. Isn't it time to put aside our pride and do what is necessary?" The king did not move. His face remained impenetrable. Without consent or condemnation, he listened silently to his son, without determining the extent of his courage or audacity. The door clicked softly. The king looked over, and calmly asked, "What do you say to that, Johannes?" Johann stood in full armor, balanced, restrained, as if he had just disappeared from his sister's chambers, under cover of night, and his expression showed a readiness to accept any sentence. Outside the window, evening was rapidly approaching. Questions, like open gates, stood uncovered before the storm, and each weighed on those present with an invisible weight. In her room, Giovinetta, still pale and half-asleep, sat under the blanket. Grisella had placed a plate of warm porridge beside her to regain her strength and protect her from a new attack of weakness. The maid silently sank into the chair opposite, bent over in thought. The anxiety of the last few days darkened her face, like a shadow that does not let go from morning to night. Then Annette whispered, as if she was afraid to hear the answer, "Will Johann be taken to the exorcism ceremony tomorrow?" And Grisella only sighed, heavily, tired and bitter. Dropping the ball of thread onto her lap, the nurse finally spoke up. "They say it was Mr. Winfried's idea. The young lord's assistants are so outraged that all the servants already know about it, even those who cook the soup in the kitchen." Giovinetta understood that if this really happened, there would be a wave of resistance. Those loyal to Johann would not allow the ceremony to be performed on him. At times, it seemed that their resolve was sharper and firmer than the Lord himself. Despite all her attempts to calm herself, Annette could not control her anxiety. The most terrible thought gnawed at her without ceasing, that the demon had still not left Johann, that he was sitting inside, waiting for a convenient moment. And what if the priest still begin the ritual? If they really try to cast out the monster, will it come out without resistance, and will Johann remain the same, or will a part of him break away that can never be returned? No one had any answers. Only prayers could calm Giovinetta a little, and she whispered them secretly to all the known gods, begging for one thing, that he only live. The porridge was warm and soft, but tasteless. Annette could not swallow a spoonful, because all her thoughts wandered to where Johann was now. On the verge of danger. What if she never had to see his eyes again? The first bell rang from the street, then the second. The third creeping fear spread its wings and turned into panic. The worst thing is when there is no one to open up to, and your feelings belong only to someone you may never meet again. Will he come to her again? Will he lie down in that chest again, holding her fragile skin in his arms? Inette and Grisella went to the window. The whole palace was buzzing. People were whispering about the arrival of exorcists, who were supposed to go to the king and his eldest son. Everyone was gathering to see the unusual ceremony. But when they looked outside, they saw no priest, only the incessant ringing of the bell with each stroke. It seemed as if the air was becoming clearer, and at the same time Inette's heart was contracting more and more tightly. Sighing, Grisella explained evenly and calmly, "These are the bells of the exorcists. When they walk through the forest, they ring the bell to dispel the dark forces around them." Giovinetta turned pale, her hands became icy, her legs felt heavy with cotton wool in her head. The bells were no longer ringing, but her own thoughts and memories, and in that darkness she whispered to herself, "So, the ceremony has already begun." Grisella stepped back from the window, and Inette stood there, staring at the sky, at the crowns, at the roof of the palace. Maybe she just wanted to remember this view one last time, or maybe she was waiting for a miracle. The knights gathered near the main hall, Winfried among them. All were waiting for the priests, for most the day had been bitter. But not for him. For Winfried it was a triumph, for he was the one who had finished this rite. Soon the procession moved towards Johann's chambers. Guards and aides lined up at the door, preparing for the unknown, as if for an uncharted storm. They stood like a wall, not knowing what to expect. They knew only one thing: the prayers would be loud, the priests would act decisively, and the truth, everyone has their own. No one knew that this fit was not at all what it seemed. Slanting, sharp glances were directed at Winfried. It was he who had instilled doubt in the verdict and had the rite performed on his own brother. Glancing at the guards, Johann's faithful dogs, Winfried thought with cold contempt, "These wretches think the priests will harm him. No wonder the father is restless. But no matter what happens within these walls, everything will stay here." The guard was like a guard of silence, reliable as rocks. However, those standing at Johann's door were not just guards, they were ready to intervene by force if the ceremony went awry. Johann himself sat in his room and waited the most for the priests, for his brother, for the verdict. His face seemed calm, even a little bored, although he was not sure that the demon would leave his body. Right now, he did not want it the most. The night stretched out longer than any before. Chicha lay sleepless, filled with anxiety. If he died, she would be unable to love anyone else. Anxiety became omnipresent. She silently listened to only one thing: the frantic rhythm of her own heart, louder than the bells, and she dreamed in that beat, "He's coming. They're coming closer, and you'll never see him again." In H's entire consciousness was occupied with one thing only: prayer. She begged Kretschmann, or whoever was listening in heaven, that Johann might remain alive and unnoticed, although she herself did not fully understand what exactly she was asking: for his life, for his freedom, or perhaps for the salvation of his soul. The light of the new day broke through slowly, as if in doubt, but when the sun finally broke the edge of the sky, Giovinetta realized she had persevered, not broken, and although at night she had thought she would die of fear, now she was here. Now she was here, breathing and holding on. Every morning Grisella brought porridge, an old habit that had become a silent prayer for recovery, a sign of concern that conveyed hope for peace. But this time, having crossed the threshold, the nanny froze. The sight made her rush towards the girl with a frightened cry, as if towards a wounded one. Inette was not lying under the blanket. She was sitting upright on the bare, icy floor, her arms around her shoulders. The heat burned her body, but it didn't matter to her. Thoughts kept returning to Johann. When Grisella bent down to help, Inette looked up, and a tremor cut through her voice. "Grisella, I didn't fall asleep. Tell me, the ceremony, how did it go? Is everything okay with Johann?" She was breathing hard, as if she had run through a downpour, but what struck Grisella most was not that, but the desperation in the way Inetich said his name. The girl had never seemed so agitated about her brother. Realizing that questioning would be unnecessary and cruel, Grisella only sighed and told everything she had heard about the night ritual, without hiding any details. After the ceremony was over, one of the knights laughed out loud, openly mocking Winfried. The laughter was so sincere that the others only looked at each other. No one objected, because everyone was thinking the same thing. The red-haired soldier, still smiling, said cheerfully, "We should have invented it, minus an exorcism for Lord Johann. But this is nonsense, an ordinary attack. Mr. Winfried, you would rather go to the theater than to politics." Then, he good-naturedly slapped Winfried on the shoulder, which made him feel like an orphan inside. He seethed, muttering to himself, "You have much strength, but little sense." Meanwhile, everyone rushed to Johann to find out how he was feeling after what he had experienced. Of course, no one found out what exactly he was holding back and what he was not allowing to escape. Johann silently removed the shackles imposed before the ceremony, so as not to harm himself or others, and the metal slid to the floor with a clang, like a dot in a humiliating scene. My wrist was burning, but the pain seemed like a small thing compared to the humiliation my brother had inflicted on me, and the longing for Annette, which cut more sharply than the belts. Despite everything, a smile bloomed on his face, not genuine, pure one. It was addressed to her alone, as if a sign, "I'm holding on, everything will pass." Annette whispered, as if afraid of disturbing the fragile miracle. "So, is he okay?" And although her voice trembled, Grisella wrote it off as the merciless heat. The nurse sat down next to him, and, smiling more softly, replied, "They say there wasn't even a fit. Johann has already gone hunting with the knights, as usual. Isn't that a sign that everything worked out?" Giovinetta exhaled, either with relief or with the realization of the price she would have to pay for her own desires in silence. She squeezed the hem of her blouse, as if trying to squeeze her worries out of the fabric. It didn't solve anything, but it kept her from falling apart, at least for a moment. Outside the window, a figure loomed on a bay horse, surrounded by strangers. They were discussing something animatedly, and she could see it clearly, but she didn't come closer. Not yet, not now. One of the newcomers threw back his hood, and a familiar face became expressive. "Ma'am." It was Winfried. His clothes hardly differed from those of his companions. He greeted them amicably, and said to them, "I am grateful to you, brothers, for responding, and hurrying. The journey must have exhausted you. Rest in Gustav Castle, regain your strength." The night seemed long, as did the journey. "I will show you where it is convenient to stop." The young man next to him responded with a gentle smile, and gestured for the rest to join him, keeping his tone even and polite. Stepping forward, he addressed Winfried more warmly, "And we are sincerely grateful to you, brother, for your hospitality. If you have the opportunity, visit our church on your way to the monastery after the time of penance is over. We will be glad to see you." However, the comrades politely but firmly refused to spend the night in the castle. They wanted to get to their native walls as soon as possible and rest under a familiar roof. The leader of the small group reminded them that they should hurry to get home in time. Everyone silently agreed and set off without saying goodbye. The march turned out to be long and silent, with a deafening emptiness between words. No one broke the silence, not because they didn't want to, but because there was nothing to say. But suddenly one of them spoke up with annoyance, "I'm tired of this endless wandering. The night seemed to be hellishly exhausting. Yesterday afternoon we received the news. We urgently set off, arrived immediately after the ceremony. The call for an exorcism was sudden. Is everything really so bad with the young lord? The day is pointless." One of the brothers looked around and asked if everything was okay. Not everyone answered. Not everyone was able to say a simple yes after such events. The very urgency of the summons to Gustav Castle, with the order to expel the essence from the young master, seemed suspicious to them. Too much in this story creaked like a rusty curtain. But they were even more confused by another, no less disturbing observation, which sent a chill down their spines. Johann, who should have been filled with resentment and pride at the humiliation, remained surprisingly calm, reserved, even submissive. They expected a protest, but received tacit consent. It was unsettling. One of the brothers could not resist a human, slightly frivolous confession. "By the way, he is handsome to the point of shameless pride. If I were to become the next Duke Gustav, I would not even change my place in the church." But suddenly, the horse leading them was thrown into a nervous fit. It stamped its hooves as if it had encountered an invisible threat. Everyone involuntarily stared forward. The eldest among them suggested evenly, "Probably she was scared. Is there a wolf prowling here?" Looking back, they saw before them a dense wall of fog, and a forest through which no light filtered, only thick darkness with no promise of light. A stifling darkness enveloped the priests. The horse neighed sharply, and made a noise that alerted something else, lurking just within earshot. Suddenly, the forest resounded with unfamiliar cries and strange sounds, which they had not encountered in any part of the world, as if the thicket itself had howled with human voices. When they raised their heads again, they saw that the horse was about to bolt into the thicket, but something else was more frightening. Only two of the brothers remained. Panic swept through the forest. Screams drowned out one another, and even the gnashing of a predatory creature lurking nearby was lost in this din, like a thin wire in a storm. The horse spurred the fugitive, exhausting its last strength, and the priest, who found himself alone in the wild thicket, began to beg his companions to answer his call, but the only answer to him was an echo and darkness. An ancient turquoise bell suddenly slipped from his fingers, stunningly beautiful, but already scarred by years, dotted with cracks and scratches, like a relic that had survived more than one invasion. Seeing the bell plummeting to the ground, the priest rushed after it, stretching out his hand as if trying to save a fragile fragment of the past. When there were only a few centimeters left to the ground, he managed to catch the shrine. It was a moment away from shattering into hundreds of pieces. A deaf, tense silence hung, and then a faint tinkling sound trembled in the air. A tinkling. The priest rolled the bell between his fingers, releasing sounds from it that, through the power of faith, were supposed to dispel darkness and drive away any filth. But fear was growing like a black wave, and panic was already breaking his will. He could not concentrate on the figure that, emerging from the darkness, was inexorably advancing, and then that someone came out from behind the bushes, and, without hurrying, moved towards them, as if weighing every step. In desperation, the priest rang the bell even louder, trying to drive away the evil spirit, but suddenly he realized his instrument no longer had any effect on this creature. The last thing he saw in his life was the face of a stranger, not a demon or a beast, but something worse, something that made his soul sink. Since then, none of the priests have returned. They disappeared without a trace, as if dissolving into the forest. Giovinetta only learned about the mysterious disappearance of the brothers called for the ceremony over Johann the next day. She sat alone in her room, muttering an old melody under her breath, the same one she had heard in her childhood when the world seemed gentler. Once, as a child, she would sit in a chair by her mother's headboard and hum quietly so as not to disturb her mother. But suddenly her expression changed. The girl wanted to say something. Her hands trembled, her voice broke, and it was not about fear, but about something deeper, nameless. Annette whispered, "Mom, can I take off this dress while I'm sitting here? It's uncomfortable to even go to the bathroom in. It's also ticklish, and I can't sleep." Coming closer, she reached out and touched her mother's palm. The woman was silent for a few seconds, then sighed deeply as if facing something inevitable, squeezed the child's hand, and said quietly, "Giovinetta, remember you are noble, so behave with dignity, and always be careful. Avoid extraneous male glances." She added with heart-wrenching bitterness, "Caution is needed even in sleep. Stay away from men, even from your father and brothers." Returning from a wave of memories, Giovinetta lay on the bed, absorbing her mother's instructions that never faded from memory, like a thread sewn to the lining of her soul. It was still hot, but Annette already felt relieved. The heat seemed like the last echo of the illness, not a threat, but rather a wave receding from the shore. Lying under the blanket, Giovinetta suddenly caught a thought that swirled like a whirlwind. What if my dreams intertwined with reality, just because I was dozing on my mother's bed? After all, it was there that I dreamed of that crazy woman who put a chastity belt on her 12-melver. The mood was heavy, oppressive, like the sky before a down. Giovinetta lay motionless, staring at the ceiling, and unling in her head the tangle of what she had seen in her dream, while next to her, quietly, without making a single rustle, Grisella sat in the daylight, and embroidered with invisible stitches of silence. Leaning closer, the nanny timidly said, "Madam, did you have a disturbing dream?" Annette nodded in the affirmative, and then asked, barely audibly, "How long did I sleep?" Grisella replied softly that it had been a day and a half already. The fever had almost subsided. Her body was gradually gaining strength, and then she gently asked if the young lady wanted to at least intercept something, and to this Annette nodded silently as well. As her gaze drifted to the window, she noticed a modest bouquet on the windowsill, a thin branch of spring flowers from a tree near Gustav Hasselade, elegant gift whose origins remained a mystery. A wave of memory swept over her. These were the flowers her wedding dress had been decorated with. La Bista, heralds of spring, but now their time had not yet come, and that made the sight seem even more amazing. Grisella slowly, with that special care that comes with age, ran a comb through and each's dark hair, then took up the braid, gathering the strands with her fingers like threads of harmony. Finally, the nurse explained these flowers were brought by the young lord, and then, after a short pause, added and expanded the story. The nurse said, "These flowers were brought by the young lord. He says he came across them while hunting myness. It was not yet the season, but he picked them for you anyway. He ordered that some be given to the potion, and some to be left in the chambers to please the eye." It turned out that Johann had appeared here in person, holding a bouquet in his hands, still washed with morning dew. He wanted to visit, at least to look at her, to make sure that she was breathing normally. Grisella was stunned by such attention, but remembering the prohibition against contradicting the young lord, she remained silent, maintaining an outward composure in her usual pattern of concern. Giovinetta understood. Johann knew well the healing properties of these flowers, so he knew that she was sick. He came when she was sleeping, leaving behind a whisper of fragrance and peace. She turned to the nurse and timidly asked, "Did anything unusual happen last night? Did Johann get worse? Was he injured?" Grisella only shook her head in surprise, and reassured, "No, my lady. The young lord was cheerful. He even smiled when he passed me in the corridor." In her mind, Giovinetta breathed a sigh of relief. It seemed that the ceremony had passed without incident, and at least for now a fragile balance, like a thin thread of peace, had reigned in the castle. Standing up, she spoke with a tangible thaw in her voice, as if a stone had been removed from her chest. "How good. If Johann really recovers, the entire castle will finally be able to breathe a sigh of relief." She cautiously approached the flowers, inhaled the air minus, and the scent was immediately associated with only one figure from now on. For her, these fragrances had one name, Johann. But Grisella, as if cutting the silver thread of dreams, suddenly spoke soberly and simply, "Oh, And the priests? Yesterday after the ceremony, returning to the church, they say, they disappeared in the forest. Missing. Inetta's fingers twitched involuntarily. She froze for several long moments, unable to move, and panic was already rising in her chest, spreading its sharp wings. She instantly felt that this disappearance did not seem like an accident. She realized with horror the nightmares had not gone anywhere, they were just beginning their dance in the darkness. Outside, night was slowly settling. Inette could not close her eyes, and her window glowed like the attentive eyes of a creature, oft yellow glow attracting the gazes of passersby, and perhaps someone else, uninvited, lurking beyond the light. Sitting in the room with her head pressed to her knees, Inette was lost in troubled thoughts. What if Johann was still under the power of that entity she didn't even want to imagine? What could have happened to those who performed the ritual? What should she do now? Where should she go, and where should she seek salvation? Tears were already welling up in my eyes when suddenly a strange, piercing grinding sound came from outside the window, a sound like a rusty warning piercing through to the bones. The window was empty, but the grinding noise did not subside or let up. She stared out the window as if waiting for the moment when something or someone would push a cold shadow inside. And suddenly, a painfully familiar hand, the same ugly demonic one, clung to the edge of the windowsill and slowly crawled up. It returned again, as if it had never disappeared. But instead of a scream, silence reigned in her soul. Yevonne looked at this hand, as if it were inevitable, and perhaps somewhere deep in her heart the belief that Johann was alive and even in this form remained. When Inette realized that the changes had only affected parts of his body, only his limbs had turned black, not his entire figure, she was overcome with confusion. She did not understand what was happening or why. Then he fell down, and landed beside her bed with such a dull thud that Giovinetta's hands trembled. Something was wrong, natural, frightening, and disturbing at the same time. Why was the transformation not completely completed? What could have prevented the change? Interrupted it halfway, the back remained wingless, and the body was smaller, not the predatory monster she had imagined it to be, only the horns, the darkened limbs, and the hair. Platinum, not at all like Johann's, but as soon as he raised his eyes, his doubts were dispelled. On this side of the darkness it was he. Ah! She caught her breath and finally whispered, "Is that you, Johann?" His body trembled as if he were being torn between two worlds. He could not speak. Broken sounds escaped his lips, something between a groan and a strangled scream. He crept closer and touched her leg. A hand, as black as coal, squeezed her ankle. But fear did not rise despite the strength of the grip. There was no malice in it. Inette carefully ran her hand over his head. She knew she was still in front of Johann, and maybe it was not worth looking for that unchanging version of her beloved. He accepted him for who he was, as long as he didn't suffer. In her mind, she repeated again what she had already addressed to Kretschmann when this creature appeared. It was not only his appearance that changed. All of Johann changed to the most secret depths. It seemed that the curse had grown from within, as if a source of defilement had emanated directly from the heart, and the mind had fallen under the control of something foreign and merciless. Horns protruded from the head, the spine twisted as if it were trying to break through the skin, and the body convulsed, slowly forming into the figure of a monster. The grip tightened, and he closed the last distance between them, coming heavily closer, like a burden carrying itself. Even then she did not tremble. She did not believe in the monster minus. She believed in him, and was certain that Johann would never hurt her, no matter what shadow he was now covered with. And then, through agony and superhuman effort, he breathed out hoarsely and sincerely, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have come. I didn't want to. But I wanted to see you so much that I couldn't stand it. Forgive me." He whispered his apologies endlessly over and over again, until, exhausted, he fell to his knees before Giovinetta, touching her knees with his forehead, as if he were asking not for punishment, but for the right to at least breathe beside her. Inette looked at the body distorted by torture, and could not understand who was controlling this figure right now. Her brother, fighting the shadow, or the invisible force that had captured his soul and was pulling him somewhere into the abyss. Suddenly, he tugged lightly at the hem of her dress, as if trying to get closer to her, but there was neither threat nor demand in this movement, only helpless despair and a feeble plea for support. He bowed his head to her knees and trembled slightly, as if in a cold wind. Wet trails darkened on his face, and it seemed that somewhere inside, Johann still lived, the same one, recognizable in every feature. As if resisting his own shadow, he restrained the force that pushed him towards destruction, pouring pain into his bones and accepting it, just so as not to harm her, even at the cost of his own broken body. Inette thought the demon did not tempt him. He forced him, and Johann, instead of submitting, broke himself from within, so as not to harm me. This is my Johann, unchanging in heart, despite all appearances. She leaned toward him, and whispered softly, the words that were to become a bridge through the darkness. It's not your fault. I'm with you. Everything will be okay. Annette lightly touched his forehead with her lips, almost imperceptibly, but in this short kiss there was acceptance, support, forgiveness, and a quiet, inexhaustible faith. After that he opened his eyes, as if emerging from deep water, and spoke in a clearer voice, no longer ringing with broken notes. Annette. A calm smile lit up her face, and this time, she didn't hold back the tears that rolled down her cheeks, let them speak instead of the unsaid. She still didn't understand where she got so much strength from. She just knew for sure now she wasn't afraid. She wasn't backing down, and she wasn't hiding her gaze. She slowly sank down beside him on the stone, winter floor, as if apologizing to the pain for his every nervous breath and every convulsion. Their breaths got a common rhythm. Annette glanced at the dark, tattered uniform on which the word night had once been easily read, and her heart sank at the memory of who he had been. Her fingers touched the fabric that squeezed his chest, not as a gesture of seduction, but as a careful attempt to ease the burden that oppressed his already exhausted body. She unbuttoned his clothes, button by button, slowly, carefully, as if she were relieving the heat, as if she were giving him medicine for the fever to restore his free breathing. Johann stared with wide-open eyes, full of surprise and anxiety at the same time, as if he couldn't believe that next to him was not fear, but a quiet, unyielding compassion. He was confused by the attentive determination with which she stared at him, not with horror, but with a warmth that did not deny the pain, but did not allow it to win. Her fingers gently slid down his shoulder, as if making sure by touch that he was still here, real, alive, not a ghost or a ghostly echo of the night. Confusion gripped him. He fought the urge to press her against him, not out of passion, but to make sure that this closeness would not disappear, that it was not a deception of a tired mind. But anxiety rose in him again in a wave, and he broke down, as if warning them both. Annette, I shouldn't have come today. I don't know who I am now. His face was burning, not from fever, but from shame, exhaustion, and a relentless internal struggle. But next to Annette, the mask didn't last long, because her gaze imperceptibly broke through any defenses. She didn't answer right away. She just held out her hand to him calmly, confidently, and said softly, as if it were a promise, it's okay, Johann. You're not alone anymore. Barely touching his cheek with her fingertips, she drew a soft line along his cheekbone, came closer, and sat down next to him, so that their shadows intertwined. They met with their eyes without any physical demand, only with a recognition in the depths, where the night belonged to both of them, not as lovers, but as two souls standing side by side against the incomprehensible. The candle on the windowsill had long since gone out, and the darkness had become a hiding place without light. Everything seemed simpler, more sincere, as if the night had removed unnecessary words. A strange closeness was born between them, which could hardly be called love. It was forbidden and untimely, yet inevitable. It grabbed hold of the heart from the inside, and wouldn't let go. Annette whispered softly, like a prayer, don't leave me, and there was no request for touch in it, just the voice of a soul that wants to stay by your side, even when the world is falling apart. For a moment, everything froze: the world, the pain, the memories, and future fears. Only he, she, and the silence remained, in which one could speak without words, and hear each other to the very core. Their gazes met again without the need for gestures. Their unity was already realized, not in the body, but in a trust that held stronger than iron. Johann placed his hand on the hilt of his sword. The cold blade struck the stone floor, and rang in the night like a foreign, unnecessary sound. He put the weapon aside. The dull thud of metal cut through the silence. It was not just a movement, but a rejection of the symbol of power and strength for its sake, for the peace it gave. Annette silently watched, and thought, the sword is the face of the night, and he threw it away for my sake, and this one could feel mercy, the real one that does not require witnesses. In her chest, her heart beat quickly, dully and painfully. They settled down on the bed. Johann whispered something inaudible, but Annette could no longer catch the words. Her gaze rested on his features, painfully and horrifilously familiar at the same time. It was a face that was a little like her own, a trifle, it would seem, but at the same time so familiar, inseparable, like the imprint of the same blood. He was her reflection, not in form, but in essence. If the world had played out differently, she would have been born Johann, and he would have been her. The moon slid through his hair, illuminating the platinum strands that seemed to smolder from within with a quiet glow. His body, though wounded by the curse, remained slender, and strong. Strength and tragedy fused in him, like a dark stone shining in the night light. Annette asked herself silently, if I were in his place, would I be able to endure the same, stand and fight the same way, without betraying myself? She didn't know how to proceed. Her movements were unconscious, just a desire to ease the pain and feel a living presence nearby, so as not to crumble from the silence. Pictures flashed before her inner vision. She looks at him strong, wounded, real, and again feels that terrible, and at the same time bright connection that breaks the rules and keeps her heart from falling apart. She wanted Johann to belong to her not in body, but in trust. She absolutely needed to know that he was still alive and not yet lost to the world, that the thread between them had not been broken. Annette, as if by instinct, reached out to him not out of thirst, but out of a need to touch reality, to be convinced of the warmth of his presence. She leaned closer, as if checking she was not an empty shell in front of her, but her brother was real, not a stranger or a ghost. In his strength he seemed impeccable. His figure did not call to the body as it inspired, and if Annette were a man, she would dream of having the same indomitable spirit and such resilience in the face of darkness. Her light touch sent a wave through him, not of passion, but of deep shock. He trembled not from desire, but from a relentless inner struggle that wouldn't let go. Her fingers barely touched his shoulder, as if drawing a talisman. Each movement was like a prayer, quiet, restrained, sincere. Johann felt awkward. He knew about the line that separated them by blood, and he realized that this line was as unbreakable as an oath. Annette looked up, and a question froze in her eyes. Had she caused pain? Had she done something unacceptable, crossing an invisible line? But he spoke differently, dispelling doubts. Who taught you to touch like that? Your gestures, they calm me down. She covered her lips with her hand and looked at him in surprise, as if asking, had she crossed the line, or was he afraid of his own shadow? She whispered flatly and simply, you don't learn this. I just wanted to be there. There was a look of surprise on Johann's face. This expression seemed to have already taken root in his new self, like a mark of what he had experienced. Annette raised her hand and slowly extended it towards him. He did not look away, as if accompanying her movement with a silence that contained acceptance. Hugging him, she whispered from her heart, it may sound strange, but when I touch you, everything becomes real. You are alive, Johann. You are beautiful in your struggle. Their faces were so close that words lost their meaning, but they were not needed. There remained a silence filled with nameless feelings. Gradually, Johann regained control. The twilight force retreated, and his will, like flint, turned his body back to itself from within. The dark shell began to crack, scattering fine dust, like ashes after a great fire, leaving room for new breath. The dust of dusk scattered through the piece, like burnt petals in this dance of destruction. Purification ripened. When he was able to move again, Annette took his hand and whispered with relief, Chess warm. Chess alive. There was no word of escape in her gesture, only a desperate desire to hold on to at least a shred of peace. And then everything superfluous disappeared. Fear, shame, the countdown of hours. There was silence, in which their tired, purified souls held each other even more tightly. The deaf, faceless longing that lived in the deepest cave of the heart woke Annette at dawn, like a call that could not be ignored. A new bouquet stood on the windowsill, the same flowers, painfully familiar, but with a different freshness, as if they had just been plucked by an invisible hand. Johanna slept in her bed, relaxed, calm, while Annette herself had not lain there for a long time, retreating into the shadows of the morning. A sleepy smile suited him like a gentle light. He was recognized in the castle by that warmth. It was not for nothing that he was called the son of Waldemar. When she came to, Annette felt that the bed was damp, but fresh as if it had just been washed, and it was so unlike her wedding night, when dark memories had seared her memory and left a heavy imprint on it. Where she lay beside Johann, not a hint of the old shadows remained, not a trace of rotten memory, not a shred of the past. There was no heavy metallic taste, or obtrusive notes in the air. There was only peace, pure, transparent, like morning breath. Johann sent the warmth and moisture of his skin, suddenly felt familiar to her, almost sacred. Nothing refined could compare to that natural closeness. And at that moment, consciousness seized a cold, bitter thought, sharp as the edge of glass. There are things more terrible than someone's death, those moments when you are forced to accept the undesirable, to be silent, to obey, to endure dark echo of the past that does not let go. She had once thought the smell that had become so deeply ingrained in her memory, and returned in her dreams, might not have been her own memory. Maybe it was left over from that first night with her husband, but she didn't want a trace of someone else's violence, that is no continuation in her present. That day, Annette met the dawn alone, but the cool air, like gentle palms, lifted the burden of loneliness from her shoulders. Light breaths of wind similar to his breathing fresh in the chest and quickly faded, like a shadow on the floor fleeing from the sun. This wind cleared her thoughts in the quiet morning. At night, when the ceremony was over, Annette for the first time truly felt her confusion, clear as a bell. She descended into the dark cellar where the demon's wing was kept, and turned to him. The smile on her lips trembled, not joyful, but rather full of regret and acceptance of what could not be hers. She whispered into the darkness, as if to a living being, "Hey, demon, I did what you wanted. Please let Johann go. That's all I ask. If only he wouldn't suffer anymore." My Johann. The sun hung over the castle, clouds covered most of the sky, but a few rays still pierced the veil, giving the day a moment of light. The fire crackled evenly in the fireplace, filling the room with peace and warmth. But whose room it was, the question hung like an undecided question. Winfried, taking a drag on his third cigarette that morning, and not taking his eyes off the flame, suddenly threw a phrase into the void that scorched the air. Little sister, she's been seeing someone lately, right? Grisella was sitting with her back to him, buttoning her dress, but as soon as she caught the familiar timbre, she immediately turned around, like a compass needle reacting to a magnet. Casting a surprised glance at Winfried, she whispered uncertainly, but sincerely, I can't believe it. The lady was always so reserved and virtuous, I couldn't even think. Winfried inhaled slowly and exhaled directly into the room. The heavy smoke spread like a haze, making the air thick and almost suffocating. Grisella was silent, no objections, no excuses. She just listened, her eyes downcast, as if hiding her thoughts in the folds of her skirt. Another puff of smoke escaped his lips, and he finally said bluntly, do you really know nothing? Take the advice and follow it more carefully. If anything happens before you move in with the old man, you'll be responsible. She nodded barely perceptibly, slowly, without words, keeping her gaze on the floor, as if putting an end to a conversation she didn't want. The crackling of the fireplace split the silence into warm fragments, and distracted Grisella from the heavy thoughts that, like pebbles, pressed on her heart. There was something hypnotic about the flames, at least to her. Winfried was less interested in the fire, but he let her watch without disturbing the fragile peace. Suddenly he took the cigarette from his lips, and with a barely noticeable smile threw it away, watching her carefully. You say, sister is virtuous, and this expression made Grisella wary. When darkness finally fell outside the window, Winfried headed for his brother's chambers, hoping that at least now he would say something to the point. Stopping at the door, he spoke evenly, and knocked twice. Brother, I have brought you that book I took yesterday. May I come in? There was no response, not a step, not a rustle. Was the room really empty at this hour? He reluctantly muttered to himself, didn't they say he returned from hunting? Did he really fall asleep? Carefully opening the door, he felt a wave of coolness. The windows were wide open, letting in the night breath and the dampness that embraced the stone. Staring at the black rectangle of the window frame, Winfried couldn't help but think, what if Johann had simply slipped away and disappeared into the darkness? Confused, he froze on the threshold. There was no point in going in. His brother was not there, nor was the answer he had been hoping for. Returning to his own chambers, he lit a new cigarette and inhaled the smoke slowly, as if savoring thoughts that lead nowhere. Extinguishing the cigarette but in the ashtray, he laughed quietly, and threw a half-joke, half-irony into the air. They say that even the most decent cat runs to the kitchen first in a quiet whirlpool, as you know. Trust in Johann had never been unconditional, but the open windows had sown in his heart a new, sticky doubt that grew like a shadow at dawn. Meanwhile, the morning light was rising over the walls, and Giovinetta turned back to the demon. She stood silently before the sarcophagus with its wing, as if before the only witness of what she could tell no one. From the outside, it might have seemed strange. Giovinetta was kneeling in front of the sarcophagus, as if talking to an invisible interlocutor, as if praying, but her words were lost in the deafening silence of the hall. Leaning her cheek against the broken stone, she whispered, demon, if you're still here, please listen to me. I was wrong. Very wrong. My wish. Let's pretend it never happened. I agree to marry even that old man from Indridason. Anyone. I don't care anymore. Her fingers trembled, and she cautiously reached out to the cracked stone, as if she wanted to touch forgiveness and beg for atonement for her frivolity. Tears rolled down her cheeks generously, and fell in drops onto the fabric of her dress, burning her face with shame and hopelessness. Sitting on the cold stone floor, she hugged her knees to her chest, and tried to hold back her sobs, even though every cell in her body screamed in pain. Please just let Johann go. Her voice broke. Take me. If you want, I'll die. If you want, make me weak. I'll take the disease, the curse, whatever. Just don't touch him. My poor Johann. I'll do anything to make sure my sins don't darken this sun again. It seemed to her that she should simply take the curse upon herself. She cut her palm, and allowed a few drops of blood to fall onto the stone of the sarcophagus. In the morning, returning to his chambers, Johann noticed two thin threads on the floor. He did not know where they came from, but he was sure that they were from her. Carefully gathering them, he wrapped the threads in a handkerchief that he always kept with him, and headed to change his clothes. A clean knight's uniform was waiting on the hook, as if it had been prepared especially for him. Putting on the armor, Johann smiled faintly, and hid the handkerchief with the threads in his pocket. Meanwhile, Annette returned to her room, tired, exhausted, devastated. She no longer wanted to think about herself or her fate. Covering herself with the blanket, she searched for the remaining sense of Johann that had not yet faded, and immersed herself in them, as if in warm memories. I couldn't watch his life fall apart because of me, she thought in silence. Only my Johann should be safe if he is happy. I don't care what happens to me. I really want that. The sun's rays glided over the vase of flowers on the windowsill. They had already wilted and lost their fragrance, but they still warmed the heart, like a glimmer of memory that never fades. The following days were a test for Annette. She was sick and lay helpless, and no potion helped. Only sleep provided a brief refuge from pain and fear. A wild neiging came from under the windows. The horse was kept separately, in a special room, because it alone could not be tamed. That horse was special, wayward, stubborn, disobedient. The assistants could barely restrain him, and every attempt to subdue him ended in nothing. From time to time, Winfried watched him from the window. He felt sorry for the animal, because only the brother priests knew the language of peace that could be spoken to him. The young lord, together with his knights, set off into the forest to look for traces, at least a hint, that could explain the disappearance of the priests. The dogs scattered across the territory, sniffing everything without exception, trying to pick up at least some trace, a shadow, a crumb of truth that would show the way. The knights scattered around the forest, calling out into the silence, with the thin hope that someone would respond, at least for a moment, and break this tense silence. Johann, as usual, was riding a white horse approaching a tree with familiar flowers. He suddenly saw it in his memory, the image of Giovinetta Waldemar brought exactly such petals every morning. Without hesitation, he plucked a fragile twig and carefully hid it in his bag, to later place it in a vase in Annette's chambers. These flowers seemed magical. Each petal seemed to cherish his presence. Even when he was not around, Annette felt close and loved with all her heart, trusting him like no one else in the world. Because of the constant medication she took every day, Annette hardly got up. However, every time she woke up, she would see a freshly picked bouquet on the windowsill. Sometimes, even in her dreams, pink petals surrounded her, swirling around her like a silent amulet. When relief finally came, thanks to both the tinctures and the healing flowers, Annette took one twig in her hands, as if she were touching a miracle for the first time. Looking closely, I thought his strong hands picked these flowers for me. That's what I remember, and my heart melts. Grisella secretly watched with what tenderness Giovinetta accepted her brother's gift, and a faint shadow of suspicion flickered in her gaze. The silence was broken by a light, delicate knock on the door, so as not to wake Annette and not to frighten her fragile peace. A painfully familiar call to Grisella came from beyond the threshold. The voice made Annette shudder, as if a string in her heart had struck. Giovinetta instantly jumped out of bed and rushed to the door, impatiently waiting to see the one she longed for so desperately. Grisella whispered something, but Annette didn't catch it. Her consciousness was completely held captive by that voice. She flung the door open and froze. Standing in front of her was someone she hadn't seen in several days. Johann was no less surprised, but restrained his expressions. Grisella was standing nearby, and he did not want to say anything unnecessary. In his hand, he held a new bouquet, even more magnificent and brighter than all the previous ones. Annette barely made an inviting gesture with her hand, and from the trembling of the corner of her mouth, it was clear that she was sincerely happy to see him. Johann, slightly moving his hand behind his back, said quietly, "Every time I came, you were sleeping. Were you really that sick? How are you now? I hope you're better." Annette responded with a smile, said she was relieved, thanked me for the flowers, and tried to hide the deep tenderness that shone brightly in her eyes. Johann added evenly, "Now the blossoming is in full swing, so I brought these flowers so that we can admire them together. I'm glad you woke up today." And Grisella stood silently behind Annette, unable to look away from their warm, almost overly intimate conversation, glancing at the bouquet that Johann was still holding, as if he had completely forgotten about it. Giovinetta asked if these flowers were for her too, and the boy, smiling silently, leaned forward slightly and handed her a thin branch. Annette inhaled a familiar scent, sweet, peaceful, with a cool note of dawn freshness that seemed to dissolve the burden of the last few days in her chest. Her gaze slid over the delicate petals, and something warm stirred in her heart. These flowers were more precious than all the others, because they were picked by his hands for her, only for her. Johann was about to say goodbye and let his sister rest, but Annette, not wanting him to take another step back, stopped him with a barely noticeable gesture. Without words, but persistently, she pulled one flower from the bouquet, and smiling faintly, brought it to her face, inhaling the scent as if she wanted to stop time and capture this moment in her memory. Johann watched silently. There was an unusual seriousness, even a thoughtfulness in his gaze, which gave the silence special weight. Carefully tucking the flower behind her ear, it seemed to grow with her. It became even lighter, quieter, thinner. The summer scent tangled in her hair and gave her appearance of fragile clarity. When he moved along the corridor to his chambers, his steps became uncertain. The image of Giovinetta with the flower was so stubbornly before his eyes that he almost tripped on the stairs. Gaining momentum, he walked as if under the pressure of his own thoughts. The world seemed to recede beyond the edge of consciousness, leaving in his head a single figure that held him tighter than any chains. In the corridor, He suddenly stopped, turned around, and silently hugged Annette by the shoulders, pressing her closer not out of impulse, but to make sure she was real, warm, close by, and not a ghost from a dream. Grisella, noticing the heat in their eyes, exclaimed in fear, "Young lord, what are you?" But Johann calmly asked her to leave the room. He looked at her with a silent plea in that look. There was one request: not to reveal what he had seen, at least not yet. Grisella did not dare to disobey the order. She understood everything, although she did not want to admit it, but chose to remain silent. This knot did not belong to her world. Closing the door, she crossed her arms over her chest and tried to comprehend what she had just seen, feeling a dark abyss appear somewhere below. Only one phrase echoed in her mind: "Madam, forgive me." Her voice trembled, and a wave of panic rose on her face, as if her body was about to betray weakness. Inside the room, the soft light from the fireplace fell on their faces. The fire created an illusion of comforted dangerous, deceptively warm calm that was more soothing than it should have been. They were silent. Both knew that their connection was beyond any limits, but it had already happened, it already existed, and there was no going back. Johann touched her hand with his lips gently, as if he were putting everything and said into that touch, and whispered, "I was sad. You are so strong. I couldn't leave." Annette could barely hold back her tears. His hands were warm and too real for what was happening to be attributed to a memory or a dream. He looked only at her. The sparkle of his blue eyes was irresistible, the same look in which she had been drowning since childhood, even when she didn't know what to call it. With each passing day, their invisible knot grew tighter, and no matter how hard they tried to hide their feelings, the truth could not be contained within the castle walls. It reverberated in the air like the warm breath of a thunderstorm. But Annette's prayer at the sarcophagus to protect Johann was scattered to ashes, for their hearts had already entered a whirlpool. She had not foreseen whether they had sinned or not. Their souls could no longer return to yesterday's purity. Their last touch left in the room not only a trembling shadow of emotions, but also a barely perceptible trail sweet after dawn, like the imprint of something that shouldn't have happened, but that had already happened without return. Several days passed. Annette and Grisella stood under a light canopy that protected them from the scorching rays, as if from an excess of light. The sky heated the earth, Mima reigned supreme, giving everyone the long-awaited warmth. Annette drank in this day, standing among Gustav's castle flower beds, and listened to the scent of the sun. Grisella turned to the lady and said with mild joy, "How good that you are on the mend. It is such a clear day today. I think it will cheer you up." But in reality, no joy touched her. Everything inside was shattered into small pieces. Johann visited less and less often, and this silence hurt more than the illness. Now that the fever was gone, Johann had no reason to visit her with it. The small comforts that had still kept her afloat melted away. Suddenly, she remembered a little thing that warmed her soul like an ember in the ashes. "A few days ago, when I was still lying in a fever, you brought me a pie," said Annette. "Do you remember? Tell me, from which tree? Did you pluck it? Because of the medicine. I didn't feel the taste then, and now I would like to taste it again." Grisella stopped in confusion. She didn't understand what tree she was talking about. She was about to open her mouth to explain that food didn't grow on branches, but she was interrupted by a strange voice. Someone smiled lightly, with an ironic tinge. The smile itself, like a flash, immediately caught their attention. When the stranger stepped out of the shadows and laughed out loud, both women started. "At first I was just eavesdropping," he said, "but I couldn't help it. Do you really think pies grow on trees? That's fantasy." He covered his mouth with his hand, as if apologizing both for his unly appearance and for scaring them with his unexpected laughter. Crossing his arms, he added, with a faint sly eye, "Future stepmother has more imagination than I expected. You impress me." These words stunned Annette. It immediately became clear to her that Henrik Asson was standing before her, the firstborn of the same man who came with a marriage proposal and brought with him only a portrait of his father instead of himself. Henry smiled again and said simply, "If your vigilant nanny doesn't mind, I'll be happy to tell you where they collect such delicious pies, Mrs. Giovinetta too." Grisella instantly stood in front of Annette, covering her with her short stature. It looked funny, but there was a lot of courage in that pose. She exclaimed indignantly, "How dare you? My mistress is a noble and chaste lady. She is not even allowed to speak to strangers, let alone go anywhere with them." Instead of embarrassment, Henry only stretched his lips in a cheerful smile, as if he were facing such a resolute resistance and was waiting to hear, as if confirmation that the game had begun according to all the rules. Looking directly at Giovinetta, he said, with slight negligence, "What's the catch? As a knight, I only wish to escort the lady, who will soon become the mistress of Asson Castle. Besides, the Duke has already expressed his consent. I would be happy if you would accompany us." In each's gaze remained steady and slightly distant, a familiar state for a creature who had spent most of her life in a room that resembled a decorated cage, where the world was visible only through the lace of the curtains. She gently touched Grisella's shoulder, letting her know she was not afraid, and said calmly, "It's all right, Grisella. The Sir Knight can accompany me. When Giovinetta took a step forward, standing in front of Henry at arm's length, his eyes involuntarily widened, and his heart beat so wildly that for a moment, he thought it would jump out of his chest. This was their first meeting, and undoubtedly, it was imprinted in memory so deeply that it will resonate with a quiet echo for a long time to come. Henry carefully, almost ceremoniously, offered her his hand, and together they moved towards the kitchen, where the smells and bustle of a living house were drawing them. When the door opened, Annette saw bustling life. The kitchen was breathing, making noise, ringing, like a separate little world in the heart of the castle. One of the cooks kneaded the dough, generously adding flour and water, without stopping his hands for a moment, like a spinner leading a thread without a single knot. Another was frying fish on a hot pan, and the air was filled with the temptation of crispy crust and juicy center, an aroma that made one dizzy. The servants busily laid out plates, forks, and napkins, preparing the dining room for the arrival of the guests, and every movement was part of an invisible ritual. Annette couldn't believe her eyes. What had seemed to her all her life to be the magic of the garden appeared, as the work of human hands. No branches shook the pies, and no one was tearing meat straight from the trees. Jars of rosemary and dried onions were piled on a long table. Pieces of meat lay nearby, and a servant was peeling potatoes by the barrel simply on the stone floor, without any unnecessary ceremony. For the first time in all her years, she saw something that turned her imagination upside down. The kitchen was destroying a fairy tale, and at the same time creating another, truer one. Glancing around the room, Henry smiled at the corner of his mouth and said evenly, "It seems they're cooking pheasant for dinner." The internet became even more numb. Her heart pounded from the encounter with the simple, and at the same time incredible truth. Food is really prepared in different ways by human hands. The cooks served them a small loaf, and Henry, accepting it with his usual grace, calmly went out into the courtyard, giving her time to catch her breath. Giovinetta examined the surrounding dishes with childlike curiosity. That day she tasted freshly baked bread for the first time, real warm, with a crackling thin crust. It was soft to the touch, like breath, warm and fragrant. She whispered, almost in surprise, "All these dishes I've been eating in my room. They don't grow on trees. They were actually made by people, with their own hands." Henry watched her with a slight smile, occasionally cracking a soft joke, but not destroying the magic of the moment, allowing the new reality to settle on her heart without haste. At her enthusiastic words, Henry only smiled amiably, and added with slight irony, "A noble lady does not need to know such things at all. Cooking, sewing, forging weapons, all this is the work of servants and craftsmen, Annette, raising her eyebrows in confusion, exclaimed, because she could not even imagine that instruments of death were made by ordinary human hands. Henry calmly replied, as if stating the obvious, "Everything around you, from the walls of Castle Gustav to your dresses, shoes, and toiletries, is the fruit of craft and calluses, not the whim of spirits or magic." He continued to give examples of the familiar things that Giovinetta used every day, and they all turned out to be the creation of those she had not noticed for years. Works, servants, masters without names. An abyss opened up in the girl's head. She realized how little she knew about the true order of the world, how many years she'd been kept away from living work, not allowed to touch even the simplest things. What for others is routine, cleaning, cooking, caring, sounded to her like a series of revelations that made her tremble, and a strange mixture of surprise and shame appear in her chest. The people around her lived, acted, and controlled their own destinies, while she spent her life in a golden cage of chambers, having no idea of the world outside Gustav Castle. Finally, understanding came. Her choice had always been made by someone else's hands, the servants, Grisella, and above all, the Duke himself decided for her. The barely noticeable sadness that shadowed her gaze did not escape Henry's attentive eyes. He spoke more quietly, more softly. "Even fame is created by people, not by hands, but by words, deeds, memory. Titanic work has been invested in the name of the Valde. We're a family. I don't know what you're thinking, Mrs. Giovinetta, but for a person without high roots to belong to your family is a great honor." These words struck her to the very heart. She suddenly realized that she had never truly thought about who she was, among whom she lived, and what she had done to have the right to bear the name Waldemar. Lowering her gaze, she said quietly, as if passing sentence on herself, "How unfortunate. I have done nothing to glorify this great name. Sometimes I am not sure if I really deserve it." The phrase sounded so frank that it stunned everyone. Even Grisella held her breath, and Henry looked with sincerest astonishment at the Duke's daughter, whose family had been respected for centuries. Annette stood up abruptly, ready to leave, but the embarrassed Henry asked, in a warm tone, "Are you leaving already, "Dear lady, did I offend you in some way?" My niece, and this defenseless sincerity made her smile faintly. With an impatient but restrained movement, she signaled Grisella to follow. Turning to Henry, she replied evenly, "Without offense, oh no. You have not wronged me, although my father has allowed you to accompany me. I do not wish to take up too much of your time. Thank you, I have learned a great deal today." There was something warm, almost friendly in the air. Their farewell was without sadness, rather with a slight nostalgia. Finally, Inette said that she was glad to see him in Gustav Castle, and disappeared behind the columns. Together with Grisella, she moved through the painfully familiar corridors. Inette knew every curve and protrusion of the walls so well that she could have walked the path with her eyes closed. But despite the recognizability of each tile, sadness gnawed her soul. She reproached herself for not having made the effort to make the Waldemar family more worthy her name. Muvati sounded like an echo of the exploits of her male ancestors. Instead of returning to the room, she unexpectedly turned into the chapel, where silent holy figures stood frozen in the stained glass windows, watching her with their gaze. Henry's words stirred an old memory that Giovinetta had tried so hard to suppress, and now, when it seemed like everything was behind her, it began to return in her nightly dreams. Obsessive thoughts squeezed her temples like an iron hoop. Inette desperately did not want to plunge again into the nightmare that had accompanied her all her life. She missed Johann. She had so much to tell: how the day had passed, what new things she had learned, how what she had seen had changed her. She wanted to hear from him, to what he felt, how he really lived. That meeting was postponed for several days. He was still wandering through the forest, looking for the missing exorcist priests. The sky was suddenly covered with heavy gray clouds, quickly swallowing up patches of blue. A thunderstorm was already on the threshold. The rain poured down without warning. Large, heavy drops beat mercilessly on the ground, and it seemed as if the heavenly waterfall had no end. The whole valley had become a wet trap. Johann must have been soaked to the bone as he weaved through the dark trees. When he finally appeared, his exhausted appearance spoke for itself. His face was haggard, his eyes were without a spark, and he had been gone for several long days. Gutters of rainwater ran across the ground, cutting through paths, and making searches almost pointless. Sticky mud clung to the soles of their feet. The boots had long since become saturated with water, but Johann paid no attention. The cold frightened him less than the futility of his efforts. On the third day, he stopped the detachment. It was obvious: no traces, no hope, only the deaf silence of the forest. Cold, irritated, and hungry, he crossed the threshold of his father's chambers. Water dripped from his heavy cloak onto the floor. Water flowed from the hems, leaving wet paths, and he said bitterly, "Except for the broken bell, nothing, no matter how hard we try." Taking off his hood, he stared at his father, waiting for some kind of reaction, a word, a gesture, a hint of attention. Then he added briefly, as if to put a full stop, "The forester says, if there are no bodies, then they are probably already in the bears' stomachs." But the father was not interested in the news, or the son himself. He was annoyed by something else, mine, that Johann had stepped directly on the expensive carpet, soaking it to the core. Returning to the fireplace, the Duke said dryly, without turning around, "Do as you see fit. Is there anything else you want to say?" Johann lowered his head, swallowed the answer, turned and left without a word, without looking back. The maid, who was washing the floor in the hallway, heard muffled fragments of conversation, but she was strictly forbidden to recount even half a word of what was heard behind that door. Soon the Duke called her to him. His voice was as cold as a scythe. Without any explanation, he ordered the carpet to be immediately removed and burned. In those days, carpets were a sign of luxury, and one clumsy step was enough to turn a valuable item into ashes. The maid sighed softly, glanced at the wet footprints stretching from the threshold, and without saying a word, began to roll up the heavy carpet, a precious thing, but now devoid of meaning, like a memory that was no longer useful. At the table, leisurely contemplating the scene, sat Henry with a half smile, in which there was a hint of mockery. He exclaimed, "An interesting sight, the son of Waldemar, and he behaves like an inexperienced child before the Duke of Castle Gustav." Without turning around, the Duke asked flatly and briefly, "So, have you had a chance to meet Giovinetta yet? The day is passing. It must have been interesting to look at her." Henry replied cautiously, "Yes, we've seen each other. She doesn't look at all like someone who has just recovered from a serious illness." The Duke nodded almost imperceptibly, his gaze fixed on the heavy drops that ran down the panes of the tall windows, as if measuring time. The rhythm of the rain on the windowsills had a strangely calming power, although the ruler's face showed no need for comfort or respite. But even he sometimes found it pleasant to stop and simply stare out the window, allowing his thoughts to momentarily fail his weapons. Without taking his eyes off the sky, he said briefly, "In that case, take her to Indrid Asan." A shadowy smile passed over Henry's lips. There was something predatory and unkind about it. Such a smile was more frightening than any words. Outside the window, The downpour did not let up, covering the surrounding world with a thick veil of water that erased horizons and colors. Meanwhile, Grisella entered the chambers of Giovinetta. Ciccio lay there, slightly twisted in pain. She knew that the lady's days had begun, so she brought a small gift. It was a heating pad, soft and warm. Grisella explained that if she put it on her stomach, the pain would ease, and maybe she would be able to sleep. She sincerely hoped that Annette would feel better by morning. Annette mentally exclaimed, "The Lord has given women blessings, but every month it burns the stomach, as if the body is paying some old punishment, and I want only one thing: for everything to pass quickly." Despite her condition, the nanny came with a bag full of things to do. "Madam, I understand that it's not easy for you, but we need to choose a dress for tomorrow's holiday. We can alter one of Mom's during the night. You're a little taller, so we'll have to add fabric to the hem." Exhausted, Giovinetta sat looking at the clothes that Grisella was moving from place to place. Her gaze was almost unresponsive, as if gliding over the colors and folds. From time to time, Annette shook her head warily, and when she frankly didn't like a dress, she sent it back to the chair with a barely noticeable movement of her hand onward. On the first day of her period, when her whole body was asking for peace and quiet, the Duke decided to throw a party in honor of his daughter's engagement. Annette didn't understand why she couldn't just stay in bed and rest. Grisella caught the fatigue and pain in her eyes. She squatted down next to her and carefully touched the girl's hand, as if trying to take away at least a fraction of the unpleasant sensations. "Take heart, madame," the nurse whispered gently. "The young lord will also be at the feast." Now the pain in her stomach had receded into the background. The strongest feeling was the anticipation that tomorrow she would see Johann for the first time in a very long time, which seemed like an eternity. Grisella continued in a quiet tone, as if afraid to disturb the peace I heard. "He returned at night, after long days of wandering around the surroundings of Gustav Castle in search of traces. Everything fell into place." Vio finally understood why Johann hadn't appeared at her door for so long, why he hadn't visited, why he hadn't left a single note or sign. Pictures appeared in his mind. Tomorrow, he would cross the threshold of the great hall, beautiful as always, and instantly find himself in a circle of ladies, each of whom would seize the moment to speak to him, at least with a word. His red cloak, bright as a flame in a forge, will certainly stand out from the crowd like a lantern shining in the night forest, not allowing the gaze to get lost. The thought of those girls involuntarily brought Annette back to her own appearance. At that last meeting she tried to remember how she had appeared before him, and what he could have seen. Her hair was tangled then, uncombed after the fever, falling in heavy strands over her shoulders, like the shadow of illness, and her body, weakened and covered in sweat, had not yet recovered from the long days of weakness, when she hardly got out of bed and lost track of time. Suddenly, Annette exclaimed briefly, sharply, like a string snapped from a bow. Her face changed. She stood up, ignoring the pain that gripped her stomach with a new wave, and stubborn determination flashed in her eyes. She ordered firmly, almost royally, "Bring me all my mother's jewelry and dresses. I want to see absolutely everything." By morning the rain had stopped, and the air had become fresh. With a slight coolness, the sun gently touched the gardens, promising a warm, clear day without rain. The dew was still trembling on the leaves from the faintest breath of wind. Transparent drops fell on the grass, like scattered pearls rolling silently. The castle was in a state of pre-holiday bustle. Servants, maids, and assistants each had his own business. Some were setting out plates, others were chopping meat, cheese, and vegetables for the lavish table. The table shone with luxury. Candles flickered among the food, single and in clusters in candlesticks of various shapes, adding warmth and a solemn, soft light. The celebration began. The guests entered the main hall one by one, took their designated seats, and talked in whispers, casting interested glances to the sides. Henry, leaning towards the Duke, asked leisurely, "Will young Lord Waldemar be present today?" The Duke put down his glass and, his face changing, answered in a voice with a harsh note. He seemed to be working out every word so as not to betray his mood in anything. "He and his knights will appear soon," said the Duke. "If he has understood the true meaning of this gathering, he will enter quietly, without making any unnecessary noise." But almost at the same moment, one of the guards shouted to the entire hall. The young lord had arrived, and was standing on the threshold. His appearance coincided with the Duke's last words as a mockery of fate, as proof that peace does not always obey human will, and comes when you do not order it. The son of Waldemar stepped into the main hall, a young lord, the pride of Castle Gustav and the Duke's firstborn, whose appearance always raised a murmur of whispers and a wave of respect, like a tide rolling onto the shore. Behind him walked his knights, like shadows merged with him, like guards of fortune itself, in purple cloaks that swayed softly in time with their steps, emphasizing the restrained grandeur of the procession. The guests' gazes instantly opened and converged on the newcomers. In each figure, discipline, devotion, and steely strength were read, which did not require unnecessary words to be heard. Johann bowed low and spoke evenly, without pathos. "Father, Lord Henry, I beg you to forgive my tardiness. and the hall, frozen, caught both apology and dignity in his tone. His calm smile dissolved the tension in the air. Like salt in warm water, Henry never took his eyes off him, considering the Duke's son no longer as an inexperienced youth but as a mature man. Mentally, he acknowledged what he didn't want to notice yesterday. It seemed that he was just a child in front of his father. But today, minus an unexpected, bold step in. Why be surprised when the Duke gives his daughter to the Andrida sons for the jingle of coins? It is no coincidence that the eldest son voices his discontent. Suddenly, the Duke rose from his seat and moved towards Johann sharply. Almost like an arrow, the determination in his gait seemed like a sentence written in advance. He was there faster than anyone in the room could remember. The movement was as precise as a blow that needed no repetition. Johann did not flinch or take a step back. With the same smile, he awaited his father's words, knowing full well that the true meaning lay hidden behind them. The Duke spread his arms and exclaimed with feigned fervor, as if rejoicing, "Come into the hall, my eldest son. I am proud of you." But the gleam in his pupils betrayed a coldness far removed from paternal pride. At that moment he dug his fingers into his cloak and squeezed his son's shoulders. The smile remained on his face, but the touch screamed without words. It was all theater, a cover-up, a complete mask. Leaning closer, so that no one would catch even a whisper, the Duke whispered sharply, "How dare you come here with knights, and armed ones at that? Who exactly are you trying to scare in my castle?" Johann kept his composure and replied calmly, almost aloof, "You probably know better than I do why this question irritates you so much." And both understood perfectly well that he was talking about Giovinetta and the person she was assigned to. Giovinetta watched everything from the secondly, unnoticed by anyone, yet visible to herself as if in the palm of her hand. The pain in her stomach made her hug herself, the way one hugs a frightened child to keep the tears from escaping. She took a deep breath, gathered herself, and, mentally stepping over her own weakness, moved toward the stairs with quiet but stubborn determination. The guard announced to the entire hall, clearly and solemnly, "Lady Giovinetta has arrived." And Annetta entered slowly, with a dignity that spread like a wave, touching every face. Everyone turned to her, the Duke's daughter, who had been hidden behind the walls of her chambers for years, like a secret that the world had supposedly not yet grown to understand, but had always longed to peek into. A whisper, like the murmur of waves, rolled through the hall. "That's why they took care of her. How beautiful she is! Just look how she has changed since the last time they prepared her for the wedding." And then, Henry's voice cut through the air, without a shadow of embarrassment, and with a hint of delight. "Incredible, unsurpassed." All eyes were fixed on her very step. Every line of her dress and posture seemed to speak without a voice what a true, flawless young lady should be like. She embodied other people's dreams, a fusion of beauty, restraint, and noble manners. The tenderness of her features and modesty intertwined in her so naturally that it took one's breath away at first sight. For the first time since her husband's funeral, Annette stood in the crowd, but among all the faces, only one figure existed for her. Her gaze, like a silent cry, pleaded, "Johann, please look at me." When their eyes finally met, Giovinetta's smile, like a ray of morning sun, spread light throughout the entire hall. Johann looked at her as if she were the only star in this human sky. There was no room left in his gaze for the others. A storm arose in their souls. A single glance crossed their faces, shaking the inner banks and confusing the guidelines of reason. Annette's eyes silently cried out, "Look only at me. I am here, in front of you. Do you see? I am here." Cheeks flushed, but she did not look away or try to hide. Even if she had the strength, she could not have done so. But it was not desire that made her turn away, it was circumstances. One of Johann's knights Stocky walked straight up to her, and spoke so loudly that the words seemed to roll in waves through the entire hall. He announced solemnly, "Allow me to introduce myself, Sir Bartion. I have been serving the young lord for over a year, and I could not wait for the opportunity to greet you." And for a moment, there was a dizzying silence in the hall. In order to see his face, Annette had to raise her head. High, he was almost 2 heads taller than her. His voice was insistent, almost harsh. The ringing of the words made my temples throb like a church bell announcing the arrival of exorcists. She didn't have time to answer when Bardion grabbed her hand. "Here. She is Pearl of Castle Gustav. No wonder legends go about your beauty." The grip was too firm. The fingers squeezed the wrist painfully, causing the skin to shrink. Annette was confused. The words stuck in her throat. The tips of his mustache touched her hand, and a wave of deep hostility rolled over her skin. She wanted to free herself, but her hand was tightly clenched. Tears welled up in her eyes. Every cell in her body screamed that it didn't want this, that it was afraid and sad. And at that moment, the memory returned how Johann touched her palm, just as suddenly, but completely different. Unlike the rough knight, Johann was gentle and attentive. He saw her condition, felt her mood, and always took care not to hurt her. Meanwhile, the hall laughed, clapped, and greeted the knight, while Giovinetta stood stunned, Not understanding why no one was stopping the intruder, her eyes were searching for salvation, but the festive hubbub swallowed her pleas. To most of those present, Barthon's gestures seemed ordinary, even polite, another, so to speak, show of respect for the lady. Praise poured in on him from everywhere. His fame grew, but no one even mentioned Giovannitta's feelings. Few people cared that a stranger was pressing his mustache too close to her hand. The same oppressive feeling, it rose again from deep within, from belly to throat, as it had done in that room, when the crowd had watched her humiliation on her wedding night, some with cold curiosity, others with feigned pity. Then no one cared about the frightened 12-year-old girl, and now, when the rough warrior clutched her wrist, there was again no hand nearby to serve as a shield. Giovannitta began to back away, struggling to break free. Her face was contorted with tension. She didn't want it. Her eyes were pleading for help. Tears glistened on her cheeks, and despair added firmness to her movements. She tried to push him away from her, but he remained deaf to her resistance. And suddenly, the knight's body was torn from its place. As if by a powerful squall, he was thrown up and spun in the air before crashing heavily to the floor. Bartion fell face down, and never rose again. His elongated figure froze like a puppet thrown to the ground. Was Johann. He snatched Giovinetta from uninvited hands quickly, silently, and without the slightest hesitation. The day was shining outside, and the celebration was in full swing, but some scenes of that day were written far from the ceremonial hall. Winfried and Grisella were left alone in the library. Forbidden passion flared up again between them. Winfried kissed her feverishly, clumsily hastening to unfasten the clasps on her dress. Surprised and frightened, Grisella looked into his face. Mr. Winfried, what are you doing? You should be at your sister's party. Anxiety trembled in her voice. Winfried only shrugged carelessly. Have you forgotten that I am only a monk who has stumbled, and there was no opportunity to be alone with you? You're constantly at my sick sister's side, and sitting at a feast is wasting time on empty talk. Grisella had barely had time to look back when a figure flashed past. The woman, painfully familiar, and at the same time disturbing, just the silhouette of her made everything inside her tense. She resembled both Annette and Johann, but had dark, almost charcoal hair that flowed in waves to her shoulders. The woman spoke evenly, but authoritatively. What are you doing here, Grisella? I asked you to look after my child. Grisella was petrified. Panic had taken hold of her. It seemed that Winfried had not seen her, and the nurse's own heart seemed about to burst from a wave of fear. This face was etched into my memory, expressive, painfully recognizable. It could not be a ghost of chance. It was Annette, the same features, the same line of the mouth, but Giovannitta's mother had died many years ago. Was that really so?